vote to approve the addition of an agenda item this morning, and that is an agenda item titled Transfer of Wildlife to Universities and Zoos. And so we're going to discuss a specific proposal. We'll have Deputy Chief of Wildlife Scott Edberg come up and make this presentation later with respect to a project involving pronghorn going to Minnesota. So is that accurate, Scott? Okay. So, Mr. President, members of the Commission, the Department would recommend that you vote to approve adding that to the agenda this morning.
I would so move.
Seconded.
Commissioner Crank moved and Commissioner Smith seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. It's added to the agenda. We'll put it on number 17, I believe.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. President, I would just, the only other comment I'd make at this point is, as you know, State Treasurer Gordon will be here today. We're being flexible for him. He's going to try to be here about 10 o'clock. So he may be running a little bit late. I understand it's snowing down south.
So we will just fit him into the schedule as conveniently as we can for his.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
questions, comments? Did I miss anything?
Nope. Thanks. Morning, Jennifer.
Good morning.
Sorry to cut you short yesterday.
Some people ask too many questions.
Yeah.
Who would that be? The Rock Springs Republican.
Good morning, Commission President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot. I'm here to continue where I left off last night regarding changes to Chapter 44. So I'm just going to kind of pick up where I left off last night, and then I'll just kind of wrap up a summary at the end since we did get interrupted last night. So this was a slide that I was on yesterday, which addresses adding a specific date for an applicant to qualify for a pioneer license. And so this is the date we had used in our system previously that was published in our application hunting booklets. That was set, it was always tentatively set when we did the next year. So this now just clearly identifies that date in the regulation.
We have a question, Jen.
So what's that saying?
So it just says that when you apply for an application, if you qualify as a pioneer by that date, meaning normally you have to qualify before the hunting season. Well, in this case, they would be qualified to go out and hunt as a pioneer when the season's open, but we're giving them that opportunity to apply as a pioneer for that license that they would qualify during that time frame when they're actually utilizing that license. And this is how the system's operated before. It was just never a set date in the regulation.
I saw a comment in there and I'm confused. How old is a pioneer? 60-some, whatever it is?
Commission President, it's 65. Mm-hmm.
So if a guy turns 65 in September, when he applies, does he apply as a pioneer or does he apply regular?
He would apply as long as he qualifies by June 20th.
Qualifying being what?
65.
Being 65 by June 20th?
That's correct.
So he'll, okay, that was what the comment said. I'm going to turn, whatever, 65. So he has to go do it the next year then, okay.
That's correct, Mr. President.
Mr. President, is this different than we do juveniles? You know, like youth hunting? I know if you're going to be 12 by the time the season opens, but you're only 11, at the time of the application, you could apply. So is this opposite of that, or is this the same?
Commission President, it's similar. So for our youth, we do allow them, if they're going to be 12, then they can apply. And also, if they happen to turn 18 when the season opens, if they are 17 when they apply, they still qualify for the youth license.
Okay. So this is kind of the opposite. You have to qualify to be a pioneer by June 20th. If we adopt this.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Right?
Yeah, why are we?
That is correct.
Why are we doing it differently? Why are we changing this? What's the problem that we're addressing?
Commission President, we would just put in at the specific dates, because when we go to the leftover draw, we wouldn't publish a kind of a packet for applicants to review, and so we needed a specific date so that all applicants, whether that was in the initial draw or the leftover draw, knew what that date was. It is no different than we had operated, as I said, in the initial draw for as long as I know. It's just that we had to have a specific date identified for the leftover draw.
So, sorry, Mr. President, but so today, without the passage of this regulation, if I'm gonna I wish I was a pioneer because you only pay like $2 for a license. It's an amazing deal, but if I'm gonna be able to be a pioneer come deer season, October 15th, so if my birthday's in September, I have to wait a whole nother year now, right?
Commission President, that is correct if you're submitting an application in the initial limited quota draw.
Okay.
If I can, Commission President, another thing I'd like to also help with the explanation here is that in our Chapter 44, we have a definition for a youth applicant, and that's where they have the more flexibility of being 11 at the time of application as long as they're 12 when they hunt on the license. So I think the difference is that we actually define a youth applicant in regulation where we don't define a pioneer applicant. And so this time frame would establish when you have to qualify as a pioneer applicant. That helps.
And Mr. President, one last question. I mean, and the problem we're trying to solve is, I mean, why do we need to do this?
Commission President, we are just trying to identify for our customers in regulation the actual date we're using. Right now, the date is hard-coded into our computer system and published in our application booklet that we publish online that a lot of our customers may not find. So this clearly articulates the date we are using when we conduct those draws and where an applicant has to meet that date, their age, by a specific date that we're currently using.
Would it really mess you up if we just said a pioneer is someone who is a pioneer at the time the season opens? I don't want to cause you grief, but this just seems like a weird deal. It's different than we do youth and
Commission President, I think we could do that as long as it was the earliest date of a season, because our seasons do have different open dates. So depending on where they would hunt, I think it would make it more complicated if it was specific to where they wanted to hunt as opposed to the earliest season of any of our big game seasons.
that sounds really complicated, because if maybe they might qualify to be a pioneer to hunt antelope in early September. Well, they might not qualify to hunt antelope in early September, but they might qualify to hunt whitetails in Crook County in November. That would really complicate your life, wouldn't it?
It would,
I
Commissioner
don't wanna
President,
do
it would
that.
complicate it if it was the earliest season for the species they were hunting, because then in that instance, they would apply as a pioneer for an antelope, but wouldn't get that opportunity for deer because that season opened later.
I never mind. It's too complicated. I don't want, you got a complicated enough life, so I'm not gonna mess with you over this.
Do I have to do some things? Okay. So as this is just a clarification. Previously in Chapter 44, we had to identify that effective January 1, the combination license due to a statute change. So this is just cleaning that language up to remove the effective January 1 date in there. As I had mentioned yesterday, we went through on a lot of our sections and changed application to completed application. So this is just one more instance where we're adding completed in front of applications. Similar here for both when the ELS system and our landowner applications must be completed applications as well. So we've added a new section C under reservation of full price licenses. This specifically applies to individuals who receive approval from the License Review Board, which you discussed yesterday, for a carryover license. So currently, members with good cause under Chapter 23 can receive a carryover for a full price big game license, so full price elk, deer, antelope, moose, sheep, goat, bison. Excuse me, not bison, to carry that over. So this just specifies that if they receive approval for that carryover, that they can go in, our residents can go in and purchase a general license the year of the carryover. So last year we had quite a few carryovers for a deer area that was closed, and those customers were allowed to go pick up a general so that they could go hunt deer. So this is just cleaning up some of that new carryover provisions. Along with that, if they are granted that reservation under the License Review Board, they will not have their preference points restored because we allow them the opportunity based on that carryover to pick that license up next year. So we do not restore their points, and they're not eligible to purchase a point in that year they drew the license, because technically they are getting the same license the following year. And so that's what H is stating. And then J indicates that if they did receive that carryover, they are ineligible to apply for that same species full price license type in the draw the following year. So those customers who received, say, a moose carryover are not allowed to apply for a moose license the following year, because they are going to receive that license if they pay the $10 fee in the next year. And so this just adds that language in the regulation. Some changes again to chapter 20, section 24 is just adding completed in front of application. So also in section 24, under applicant disqualification, we added a new section G that says that any person who has an application disqualified as a violation is punishable under Title 23 and then Wyoming statutes for violation of commission regulations. And this was added because last year we did have several people manipulate our application system to either submit a license to applications, or they were attempting to manipulate our system before the leftover first come first serve to basically have a computer program submit and reserve licenses. So this just allows, if this is caught in regulation, that it is punishable if they are manipulating our systems to submit multiple applications. In section 25, we just clarified and added game and fish in front of department in 2 places. In section 26, for refund of licenses or reissuance, we had to clarify some language. It was brought to our attention that siblings wasn't included. Step siblings were, but direct lineal siblings was not. So we did add that in both II and III for death of a licensee or in injury. And in this one, we just clarified for military personnel who receive permanent change of duty or assigned away from their home duty station. There was a little confusion in how that sentence was worded, so we just inserted that to clarify. In the last one, we did add the word or a natural disaster, that we could issue refunds for people who were unable to use their full price license. So a few changes we made to section 29, which is our super tag licenses and our super tag trifecta license. This is the same statement as I had mentioned yesterday. We added to the governor's license that wild bison is super tag trifecta and super tag bison license is not valid in hunt areas where we have a quota of less than 10 for wild bison. So this just matches what was added to the governor's. And then just a cleanup and clarification to change the word will to shall in this section. So we made a couple changes in D and E. So in D, we just removed that we have to notify the winners of that by July 15. And the reason for that is we do conduct that draw. It's on a pretty short time frame, but the director's office does like to contact those winners personally and personally congratulate them. And depending on schedules and how the dates fall, that can be a little tricky. And so we just removed that date with the expectation that we're still going to get it done quickly, but that does allow the director's office that opportunity to call those customers. And in E, we just removed the language on how the draw is done. It's all pretty much done simultaneously, It's just based on a random number, and the person with the lowest random number wins. So it doesn't have to be done, which the single's done before the trifecta. So that's all that does. And in I, that's correcting 2 spelling errors that were not caught previously.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Can you quickly tell us, how do the drawings work? Do the regular drawings work the same as the super tag? So I submit an application, I assume I get a number, right?
So Commission President, so parts of the draw work similarly. The first step in any draw is to assign our 2 random numbers to every applicant. The reason we assign 2 random numbers is in drawings with preference points. So elk, deer, antelope, moose, sheep, we assign the first random number is used for the preference point drawing, and the second random number is used for the random portion of that draw. And that is that an individual who maybe gets 1 bad random number doesn't go through the draw. They have a second opportunity with maybe what they would consider a better random number. So in the super tag, we strictly look at the random number 2, and it's the lowest random number that receives the license. It's basically a 2-step draw. Our other draws are much more complicated than that.
Okay.
So this is just a summary of all of the public meetings that were held around the state. Chapter 44 was taken to the public meetings along with the hunting season regulations that Doug Bremeyer discussed yesterday. So this just shows how many of the public was in attendance and if there were any organizations and how many attended at each meeting. This is just a summary of all those meetings. So in conclusion, we had 567 attendees in the public and 14 organizations. And the deadline for submitting those public comments was March 30th. On Chapter 44 specifically, we did receive 8 public comments through the online system, and then we did receive 13 written comments, and those should have been included in your packets as well. I did want to point out that Jean Cole did attend an outfitter meeting towards the very end of that public comment meeting period, and the outfitters did provide, my understanding, is a letter to Commission President Culver with basically a support for the leftover draw, but they would like to discuss the time frame of when the application period is open. And I did speak to Lee Livingston and, Todd Stevie. There was 2 public comments that they were going to present yesterday, but I did commit to them that I would make that comment to make sure that you guys were aware that they did have a concern with the length of the application period that we had proposed to leave the leftover draw open. Currently, we had proposed a 10-day application period, and I believe they support a 5-day application period. But I did commit to bringing forward their comments and making sure you were aware of that. So that's not on the slides because they were done before we had that confirmation. And so at this time, I would ask the department to approve the recommendations to Chapter 44 as presented, and I would stand for any questions.
Mr. Chairman, go ahead, Pete. Can you work with the outfitters proposal?
Commission President, we can work with that. We are open to the 5 days. What is most important to us is that we do have the leftover draw to create that fairness to our customers and reduce that risk of failures to the department. So we can work in that time frame. It gives our customers a little less time to apply and means that we have to do a really good job of promoting once the draw results are released that they need to get on and apply immediately for the leftover period. So yes, we can.
Mr. President?
Yes.
So I've been with Todd Stevie. It takes him 5 days to saddle a horse. So I'm wondering why is the 5 or the 10-day important? Because we're going to have the draw, and then the department has to notify everybody what licenses are left over, correct?
Commission President, that is correct.
And then our hunters are going to have to figure out what they want to apply for and maybe contact landowners and maybe secure permission to hunt and all that kind of stuff. So it seems to me 5 days is really short, but did they express why they want 5 days versus 10?
Can I let Jean address that, because she was actually at that meeting?
President Culver, Commissioner Crank, the discussion at the meeting was that they were wanting to limit, I believe, the applicant pool for some of those licenses that were only a few licenses left, and having a longer application period would have a lot more competition for those limited number of licenses, is what the discussion was at the meeting.
Which, from my perspective, is what we're all about. I mean, we want to try to have everybody have a chance to get a license and hunt, right? So,
And we discussed that a 5-day period would be the minimum amount of time we would want the application period open, and a 10-day would be the max. In the past, we had a 20-day application period back in 2008, and that was because we were manually entering applications and needed that time frame to do that. So we certainly are flexible with any time frame between 5 and 10 days.
thank you.
Other questions? Do have a couple of blue sheets from the audience that would like to address this. Howard, you take the podium, please.
Thank you, President Culver, Commissioners, Director Talbot. Thanks for a chance to, my name is Howard Ewart, and I thank you for the chance to comment on the leftover license recommendation. I'm probably one of the few people in Wyoming that's participated in all the different systems for the last 50 years at the Game and Fish that's come up with to distribute licenses. And I start off with the first one, just to give you a brief history of it. The first one was at the old Game and Fish office out by the fairground entrance. You had to line up to get some kind of license. I've even forgot what kind of license that was I was getting then. We were out there daylight or before and stood till 8 and then processed through. A little time later, Game and Fish decided to give the licenses to sporting goods agents. Well, there was a problem or two with that. They gave some licenses to one sporting good agents and some licenses to other sporting good agents. Well, one time I happened to want one from each one. So I had to get in line first place and then hope that there were still licenses left at the second. But anyway, those went by the wayside. 12 or 15 years ago, some licenses were sold at the Game and Fish office and others at sporting goods stores. And that system blew up in the first minute of trying to put that together. Ended up, we were given receipts to come back later in the day. We were going to get a license, but they couldn't print them until later in the day. But that worked out okay. I got my license that time. And then the present system that we've been using, it worked fine for a year or two until everybody learned how to beat the system. Well, my wife is my computer agent, so I'm sitting there with her doing this and that kind of thing, and we were beaten by everybody the third year. Well, the third year, I think, was when it blew up. We couldn't get on for ever. So it works out that I'd given up trying to get leftover licenses because we weren't fast enough to beat the system. And that's why I really liked the proposal I heard yesterday and total support of that proposal. And I hope the commission approves that.
Thank you. Appreciate the history and
Thank you.
and Cy Gillian.
President Culver, members of the commission, Director Talbot. Basically, I'm the leftover from yesterday to speak on behalf of Wyoga as far as discussing this proposal. The first thing I'd like to say is that the Outfitter Association did formally vote to approve and support this proposal, but I think it's really important to understand why. The first thing is we are never in favor of a leftover draw. I mean, that just goes against everything that we would consider appropriate because we've been dealing with first come, first served licenses for a long, long time in our industry. When this first came up by the department, and Jean approached us about it, I'm gonna say this right away. She did a phenomenal job of writing up a statement of reasons as to why the department needs to do this. In fact, she did such a good job that all of us just kind of looked at each other and went, I guess the train's already left the station on this one. And we basically just gave up because there's no way we could come up here and argue against it. I mean, all of her reasons were just super. She did a phenomenal job with it. They were airtight. But I think it's important that you understand the context of our concerns as to why we have concerns with this, but we're going to support it. First of all, the reason a license is left over is because a resident didn't put it down on his application. These are resident licenses that are left over. These are not non-resident licenses that are left over. So we just finish up with a May 30th deadline, which is super, super long. They've had months to apply. And then, and I don't even understand why there's a single leftover resident license or why there'd be a single resident application for a leftover license. Because they physically, it's impossible for them not to get these licenses if they had asked for them in the initial draw. So in our situation, it's different. A non-resident has already had his draws. He didn't have access to these licenses. So therefore, he's the one that's going to be asking for these tags in theory. In theory, there should not be a single resident asking for these licenses. But as we know, that's not how it goes. So we get stuck with another layer of bureaucracy of trying to obtain these tags because for whatever reason, they didn't apply for them. So there's this land rush for these leftover tags, which has crashed the system multiple times. I've been a victim of it. I've been part of the angry phone call mess, the whole 9 yards. And our initial reaction to Gene was, is if we're crashing the system because of the sheer volume of requests for these licenses, why don't we stagger them? Why don't we do elk on Monday, deer on Wednesday, and antelope on Friday? That seems simple enough to me, but it's not a solution that the department wanted to look at. So we're like, okay, well, let's go with the leftover draw then. Our biggest concerns are the fact that we think it can be done. We're going to support this. We're going to support it and we're going to deal with it. But we think it can be done by staggering those dates in those species. It would just incredibly lower the volume of what they're dealing with their credit card processors and everything else. The other thing that really concerns us long term is right now everybody's on equal footing. And I just painted the picture to you that there should not be a single resident asking for a leftover license. They should have been able to get them in the initial draw, otherwise they wouldn't be left over. Okay, so right now everybody's on equal footing. It's doesn't matter if you're a resident or non-resident, these leftover tags. My concern is that down the road we're going to have a second drawing with preference to the resident hunter on an 80-20 split. And we all do have that concern. If just like we do on the initial drawing, where 80% of the licenses go to the residents in the limited quota deer and antelope, 20% to the non-residents, and elk it's a 16% 84 split. So we're concerned that down the road we'll have a second drawing with those second quotas split like that. Right now we've been assured by the department that's not the case and that's not the way the regulations are presented. But as we all know, commissioners change, things change. 6 years from now, there'll all be new faces up here in the commission. So that's where Wyoga is. And like I said, Wyoga's official stance is we do support it. The timelines are extremely important to us. And it's not, there again, it's like we need to do this thing and whip it out as fast as we can. Everybody can find out the results. The dates are published well in advance of when the draw dates are, when the results are going to be published. You can look at that. You can see if you drew a license. There's no reason to drag this thing out another 15, 20 days waiting for people to submit applications. Because if they don't get a license in the second leftover draw, there's still going to be leftover licenses, and those are going to go on first come, first serve. So we would really request that you pump this thing through as quick as you can. And a lot of it's for us trying to get our hunters booked, trying to get them a license so they know they're a license, so we're not dealing with a August 1st or July 25th of knowledge whether or not they got a license, and then try to get them in a camp 30 minutes later or 30 days later. So that's one of the main reasons we wanted to pump this thing out as fast as we could. And it's all electronic anymore, so the knowledge, the information that you got a license or not is just instantaneous. So it's not like the old days where you had to wait for a piece of paper to come in the mail and tell you you didn't draw. So that's why we would really hope that you guys pump this thing out fast and don't delay. Questions?
Questions for Cy? Thank you, Cy. Mr. Nesbitt.
Mr. President, if I may, I just was talking with Gene. There was another important discussion that occurred when we were discussing whether the department could, what our perspective was on this 5 days. And I think it's important for the commission to understand that right now, those licenses that are really those that are going to be, those that are competitive, that necessitate the need for a draw, those folks that want those are competing for those basically now in the first hour of the draw. The way we're doing the process now, they're all having to, quickly submit their applications on one day in the first hour of the day. The reason that we feel like we can live with 5 days is because that we're basically taking those folks and they've got that now only have an hour to apply, would have 5 days to apply. That's important to note. And then, for those other licenses that that aren't high demand, I think it's irrelevant.
Thank you.
Questions?
Mr. Nesbitt, Mr. President, Brian, so the leftover draw licenses, in my experience, are places where there's difficult access. You may have large amounts of private land where the private landowners don't let people hunt, or an outfitter has it leased, and so folks can't hunt. There are reasons why those are usually left over. I doubt there are any Green Mountain elk tags left over ever, where you have public land and you have a lot of access for residents to hunt. So I'm concerned. Tell me if I'm all wet. If you want 5 days, we can probably do 5 days, but it seems to me that there's the draw. You got to get online. You're notified that these are so the department would have to put out what are the remaining licenses. And it's not as simple as just saying, I'm going to pick that one. I would hope that folks would go figure out access and talk to landowners and see if so it just seems to me 5 days is kind of a crazy deal, that 10 would be better, but I can live with whatever you want. If you're lobbying for 5 days, tell me and I'll make a motion for 5 days.
Yeah, Mr. President, there's advantages to 5 days in getting, for many of the reasons that Cy just discussed, and getting this done and getting hunters notified and getting the draw complete as early as possible in the process. I will tell you that a lot of the, I believe a lot of the demand for those leftover licenses are residents who are, you can only pick up one cow-calf license in the initial draw. And so one of them that I know of that's a very high demand leftover license is a Hunt Area 7 Type 6, which is a cow-calf. And that's because folks are trying to pick that up as a second elk license. And you can't do that in the initial draw.
Is that a reduced price license in the second draw?
It is.
Okay.
Some of the others are, I didn't draw what I wanted. I didn't really know what to put for a second choice. And so I'm just going to see what's out there and I'm going to go pick it up in the leftover draw.
So
I think
do you
those
want,
are the resident reasons for picking those up.
do you want 5 days?
My recommendation is that we go with 5 days.
Okay.
Other questions? Pete?
I don't have a question. Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept the recommendations for Chapter 44 with the correction or with the change of making it a 5-day limit on the application deadline.
Second.
Commissioner Crank, seconded. Mark?
Mr. President, as everybody's been involved in these, I quit putting in because of this computer fast, but I think I'd lobby for 7 days. I'd need something in the middle, and I don't know if that's how you guys feel about that, but I know one summer I was out of town when all this, you're out of town, you're not checking your emails, or maybe you should be checking. If it's important to you, be checking to see if there's how you drew and how many leftover licenses you are left, but you get busy and then boom, you lose it. I'd go for 7 days as a compromise. I think 5 is a little short, and I understand where the outfitters are coming from, and I don't know if they could live with 7 days, but that's my take on it.
Other discussion? Okay, we've got a motion on the floor. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Commissioner Anselmi is opposed. Motion carried.
I was opposed as well.
Mike Schmidt here.
Oh, we had two opposed. Mike Schmidt. Okay, motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, next up, Jean.
Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, we have received 4 applications during this last month from our prior commission meeting in March, in which we have applications for your consideration for appointment today. I'm going to be asking the commission to appoint 3 of the 4 applicants that we received. The first one is Tack and Treasure, which is located in Commissioner Schmidt's district. This is a brand new application from a sporting goods store, and Game Warden James Hobbs has qualified this location as qualifying as a sporting good vendor. So per state statute, if the applicant applies and the warden agrees that they qualify, having 50% or more of their inventory in hunting, fishing, camping equipment, the commission shall appoint that location as a license agent. In Commissioner Crank's district, we have a request from T's Camping Essentials, and this is a little unusual circumstance on a normal applicant for a license agent. What this is that the State Parks and Cultural Resources Agency, they have commissioners or they have concessionaires at different parks across the state. And at Kurt Gowdy State Park, they put out an RFP to request any vendor that would like to be a concessionaire at the state park. And they go through the public process and open bidding, and they select a vendor. And part of the expectation of that vendor is that they would also sell game and fish licenses at their location within the state park. So we're requesting that the department appoint T's Camping Essentials to also sell licenses in the Kurt Gowdy State Park. The other 2 applicants we have are in Commissioner Crank's district as well. And we had a request from Ace Hardware in Wheatland. They wanted to become a licensed vendor, and they are not a sporting goods store. So by regulation, the department has the opportunity to accept or not accept the application. And the local warden would like to see that particular location as a selling agent. So we advertised in Wheatland, received 2 applications, one from Ace Hardware and one from Wheatland Co-op. And the warden did an evaluation on both of those locations, and he would like to appoint Ace Hardware, as they have a variety of fishing and hunting and ammunition and camping equipment. So he thought it would be a good location, even though they didn't have enough of that to qualify for 50% or more within that location. So I would request the commission appoint Tack and Treasure in Alpine, T's Camping Essentials in Kurt Gowdy State Park, and Ace Hardware in Wheatland, and deny the application for Wheatland Co-op in Wheatland, Wyoming.
Any questions for Jean?
Mr. President, Gene, what other licensed selling agents do we have in Wheatland other than this proposed Ace Hardware? Do you know?
I do. President Culver, Commissioner Crank, in Wheatland, we have Matters Fishing Buddies, and that particular location is a seasonal location, and they're located, I believe, by Gray Rocks Reservoir. We have Fast Stop, which is located in Wheatland. They're open year-round, 24 hours a day. They sell about 6,000 licenses per year. And we have also Shopco, located in Wheatland. They're also open year-round, and they sell about 1,100 licenses. So this would be a 3rd location, open year-round, selling licenses.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions?
I would move that we accept Gene's recommendation to approve these 3 licensed selling agents and deny the 4th in Wheatland, which was the co-op store.
Yes, sir.
I would second that motion.
Motion by Commissioner Crank, seconded by Commissioner Smith. All in favor? Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you,
Thank you.
Jean. Mr. Coffran.
Morning, Mr. President, Commissioners, Director Talbot. Here to give you an update on our 2 capital construction projects, the Laramie Regional Office Lab and the Whiskey Mountain Conservation Camp. Got a few pictures for you. I know it's been just a month since our last update on this, last commission meeting, but these pictures were taken Tuesday after our owner-architect contractor meeting. You may recognize this shot. This is standing on Adams Street, looking west. This will be the main entrance going into the office where the blue man lift is. You can see quite a bit of progress has been made in just a few short weeks. We got a lot of the structural framing up in this part of the building, most of the red steel. And on Wednesday morning at 6:30, they started pouring 110 yards of concrete for the floor on the first floor of this part of the building. So they are definitely moving right along. This being building A, I mentioned last time they've split the project into 3 different parts. Building A, which is the regional office, B as the shop, C, the lab. And they've done that so they can keep the trades busy, not have one trade having to be in all 3 parts of the building, and it seems to be working quite well. Ian Catalier from Construction Management was there. He's been at almost every meeting. He seems pleased. The architect seemed pleased, and we seem pleased as well. This is on the north side of the building. I couldn't get very far back because Venture Street's right in the way, but you can see on the left where the office connects into the shop where the block layers are, getting the doors framed up, moving right along.
Okay, so the office is on the right, the shop is on the left?
The office is on the left, Mr.
Okay.
President, and the shop is on the right.
Okay.
Sam, how do you move to the next picture?
Go in the corner there, click in the corner on the enlargement, make it smaller. Okay, there you go.
This is the south side of the building. So we switched directions. Now the regional office is on the right. The shop's on the left. You can see those doors are blocked in. Probably today they were going to start putting in some more red steel in the shop portion. That little piece of concrete there by the hydrant, that's the trash enclosure. And you can just barely see the lab. It's got some red steel put up there to the left of the shop. And the last photo, this is looking from the west side of the project, so you're looking east. They're tying up the utilities in the lab, and they were going to start laying block. The lab's mostly made up of block walls for security reasons, so they were going to start laying block on those interior walls Wednesday as well. So things are moving quite rapidly. Things happen every week. I will definitely have a lot to update you on at the July Commission meeting because a lot's going to happen. The whole building will probably be enclosed and roofed and by that point. So you should be very pleased with the way the project's moving, and while they're hesitant for me to say it's ahead of schedule, we're at least on schedule, if not a little bit ahead. So with that, I take any questions on the Laramie project.
Scott, Mr. President, members of the commission, I guess I'd just like to take a moment and thank everyone who has been engaged in this. Certainly Scott and his crew and John Kennedy and others and members of the commission. This has been an incredibly long and drawn out process, and it's taken an incredible amount of effort, and we have been back and forth on this, and to see the walls actually going up on this thing is pretty exciting, and our lab folks and our regional office folks are incredibly excited. So good job to all, and wow, I can't hardly believe we're finally here.
Mr. President, Commissioner Trank, I would like to say there haven't been any change orders today.
That's awesome. I've been watching from my hospital bed in Denver for those change orders.
I knew you would be.
And I need to apologize for Mr. Kennedy because we've actually had several screaming matches over this building, and but we're friends now, aren't we, John?
We're friends.
All right.
We're good.
Good job, Scott.
Thank you. So moving on to the Whiskey Mountain Conservation Camp. We did go over for the new commissioners what the camp looked like at the last meeting. I'm proud to report that asbestos removal will start on May 1st. We're waiting on just a couple finished design plans from the architect, so that we'll probably be bidding it out completely the last week of April, and we're still on target to start construction somewhere between May 15th and May 22nd. So not only has the asbestos contract been awarded, windows and doors have already been bid and awarded as well and are under construction as we speak. So the camp's been cleaned out. Things seem to be moving along quite well, and we're still on the schedule that we agreed upon. So things are moving along quite well, and I'm hoping to have our construction manager at risk guaranteed maximum price by the end of the month. Tried to get it to you to have it by this meeting, but it didn't happen. So we will have that by the July meeting.
Okay.
And it did go down.
Good. Mr. President, members of the commission, Scott, could you remind me of what the scheduled completion date on that is?
Mr. President, Director Talbot, we're still targeting May 15th, 2018. I think we already have our first meeting. Wildlife Division is going to have a section meeting there on May 20th, 2018. So
I think we need a commission meeting there on May 16th.
I do ask the construction manager at risk that I need to know ASAP if that changes, and he assures me that it has not. So,
Great.
Any other questions on the camp?
Questions for Scott? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we are now officially on today's agenda. Agenda item 11, Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot, just wanted to help kick this off, and I'll turn it over to Services Division Chief Scott Cochran here in just a second, but wanted to kick this off and just emphasize two things. One, I want to provide a little bit of background for the new commissioners, for the benefit of the new commissioners, and I also want to emphasize an opportunity for some process improvements here with respect to the land acquisition program. So we allocated, as you can see, we allocated an hour for this. This is similar to the orientation session that we had. You heard about this program at the last commission meeting just briefly. You asked us to come back and spend a little bit more time on this, so we allocated an hour. We hope to have some dialogue with you. If you have questions, I hope you'll stop Scott and go ahead and ask those questions so we can talk about it. This program definitely warrants additional discussion, and that's why we're doing this today. We will have land acquisition issues at every commission meeting. So we spend a lot of time on it with you in between commission meetings as well. The acquisition and disposal of fee title lands and less than fee title in terms of easements are complicated, and they often take a long, long time to complete. One of the points I wanted to emphasize with you this morning is that every commission is a little bit different, of course, in terms of priorities and where they see us going, the department going in terms of priorities for the land acquisition program. And every commission's a little bit different in terms of processes as well. So in the last 10 to 15 years, we've changed our process for how we proceed with disposals and acquisitions of fee title and less than fee title property rights several times. We now have we have policy guidelines that are in place. We used to have policy guidelines, commission policy guidelines, and also commission regulation guiding the department's work on land acquisitions. We no longer have the regulation. We eliminated the regulation in 2015, and we now have an updated commission policy guideline that guides the department's work right now. We have copies of that policy guidelines. Scott, do the commissioners have that right now? Okay. Could you, Sean, and all of you have met Sean. I think you met Sean Bivy at the last commission meeting. Sean's our new supervisor of the land acquisition program. Sean, if I could get you to just hand that out to the commissioners right now, that would be good. So this policy guideline, this was last updated in 2015. And I just wanted to make a point that there's a couple of process issues and opportunities for improvement that the department would encourage you to work with the department on. And I recently met with Commissioner Culver, and I've talked with Commissioner Crank in the past on some potential improvements with this process. One of the issues that has come up in the last couple of commission meetings is if you go towards the end of this policy guideline, you'll see that right now it requires the department to come to you twice for projects, regardless of the scope of those projects. So we come to you and are seeking, per this policy guideline, approval from the commission to negotiate on projects. Again, regardless of the scope. So we are required now to come to you, get approval to negotiate on a extremely minor easement. For example, the YDOT easements that you saw at the last commission meeting at your South Park WHMA is treated the same way that a $2 million land acquisition in the Black Hills would be treated. So we've come to you, asked for your approval to negotiate on those projects, and then we come back to you when we have finished those negotiations to get your final approval. And what has come up in the last couple of commission meetings is when we come back to you for the final approval, the commission has asked questions as to why we're coming back to you on those projects. You felt as if you gave us direction and approval to finish the project to begin with, and the department would agree. So I think that if you take a look at the commission policy guidelines, and if you're in agreement with us looking at ways to streamline some of this, I think one way to do that would be to somehow define the scope of the project that would require getting the commission's approval to negotiate. And then for those projects, we would come to you and we'd get that approval to negotiate, and others we wouldn't. And I'm not sure where we draw that line. Perhaps we draw the line on certain less than fee title property rights, like easements along highways and areas that have been previously disturbed and things like that. I asked Scott, Coffrin, and Sean to think about that a little bit. So at the end of the presentation, if you want to discuss that, I think we're prepared to do that. At this point, we're not asking for any decision-making with respect to the policy guidelines, but as I discussed with Commissioner Culver, there is some opportunities for us to work on this. So if you're at the end of the presentation, if you're in agreement, you'd like us to take a look at this, we'll do that and come back to you at a future commission meeting. With that, Mr. President, if I missed anything based on our discussions we've had in the last few days about this, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to turn this over. I just wanted to emphasize that if you could take a look at that policy guideline, that would be good. Get in touch with the director's office, and we'll work with you and Scott in the services division on some potential streamlining of that policy. With that, unless there's any questions, I'm going to turn this over to Scott Coffrin, and we've got a PowerPoint presentation. And again, I encourage you to stop us, ask questions, and let's talk about these things. It's a complicated program. Mr. President, any questions of me before I turn this over?
Questions?
Yes.
Thank you, John.
Scott.
President Culver, Commissioners, Director Talbot. I'm happy to be here to talk about property rights today, and that deals with our lands branch and services division. As John mentioned, Sean Bibby is our branch chief for lands. Excited to have Sean on board. I think he brings a lot to the table. And I do appreciate Sean's help getting this PowerPoint put together. That's a whole new skill set. Appreciate his help. So Sean's a certified general appraiser, which is important in dealing with lands. Carrie Olson is also has the same certified general appraiser license. And if you don't know Carrie, Carrie has a history with the department. He's been a wildlife biologist for many years in the past. So he definitely has that unique combination of skills that definitely benefits the lands branch. Sean and Carrie are based in Cheyenne. Brian Rogden's based in our Lander regional office. And Brian has a certified residential appraiser license. So 3 team members in our lands branch team. What are the responsibilities for lands branch? They consist of facilitating the administration of commission-owned lands. They're responsible to maintain an inventory of the real property rights records, which is quite extensive. And they also maintain the accounts payable system to keep track of payments that are necessary on lands that we are required to pay. You may ask, what are property rights? So property rights consist of real property, which not only includes the surface and the air above, but also the ground below. And real property rights include all those interests, benefits, and rights inherent to the ownership of that real estate. How can property rights be transferred from one party to another? As you can see, there are many options. patents, deeds, easements, leases, permits, and agreements. So with fee title property rights, the ownership of property does not have any limitations or restrictions in regards to fee title. This is conveyed by U.S. patents and deeds, and as an owner, you have the right to possess, use, encumber, transfer, or exclude from said property. How does this tie in the commission-owned lands? Well, fee title lands owned by the commission mainly consist of wildlife habitat management areas, and in some instances, public access areas as well. Without getting too deep into the weeds, but giving you an idea of what you're responsible for and what you own, 166,000 acres of fee title, 21,000 easement acres, basically 34,000 conservation easement acres, responsible for management of 284,000 acres of federal and state lands, 48,000 acres of lake, and 372 stream miles. Quite an extensive inventory of land. And this, of course, is managed by the department on behalf of the commission. What are conservation easements? Basically, those are voluntary agreements between the landowner and land trusts or governmental agencies to conserve natural resources and land uses. And these easements are put in place to usually conserve wildlife habitat, agricultural uses, historical values, and even open space. Of the 26 conservation easements that the commission owns, we've purchased 6, 14 have been donated, 3 have been retained in sales or exchanges, and 4 have been purchased by others and donated to the commission. It is interesting to point out that 7 allow public access. There has been an emphasis in recent years to focus on conservation easements which have that component. Usually that access is allowed during hunting season. What is an easement? Basically a non-possessionary property right to use the property of another. These are usually perpetual, and some examples of these include public access area roads, utilities, transmission lines. Here's an example of one near our Spence and Moriarty Wildlife Management Area. They put in a new electric transmission line. Fortunately, the poles had to be put right next to the parking area and kind of reduce it in size, but an easement was granted for that electric transmission line to be put in.
Barnesby. And then a little history of Spence and Moriarty, that's one of the ones that were donated to us, right?
Mr. President, Commissioner Anselmi, no, we purchased Spence and Moriarty. You may see that it's called the Wildlife Management Area. That's not a typo. That was actually in the deed that it'd be called that. So technically the remainder of them are wildlife habitat management areas, but this is a wildlife management area. Another example of an easement on the Salt River, public access area. There's a landowner off here to the right. Needed access down the Commission's road to access his property. The Commission granted Mr. Rohrbaugh an easement to use our road to access his property. So most of the public access areas owned by the Commission are used for public hunting and fishing, float access, boat ramps, and parking areas.
Mr. President? Yes. Are some of the easements paid for? Like the utility easements, do they pay to do that? Or do we just grant that?
Mr. President, Commissioner Doobie, some are granted and some are paid for. I think most are paid, correct? And that money gets deposited in our operating fund. An example of a public access area, Viva Naughton. Basically, we partnered with Pacific Corp to allow access for hunting and fishing near Kemmer. The Clark's Fork public access area, north of Cody, easement along the river for public fishing. This one's close to where we're at today, North Platte River, Cardwell public access area. This is right below the outlet of Pathfinder Dam, between Pathfinder and Alcova. You may not know that a lot of that water is put into a tube for transmission, and basically this is an agreement to not only have access to this land, but they put a minimum amount of water in that for fishing, so there's a quality fishery maintained at Cardwell. Touch on some leases. It's a transfer of exclusive rights to real estate from the lessor to the leasee for a specified period of time. You, the commission, holds 35 leases on lands administered by the Office of State Lands and Investments. Basically, we lease that land for wildlife. An example of this is Elk Mountain Reservoir. I know this map's a little hard to read. Sits right here. This is I-80. We have an agreement with YDOT to park in there right away, and then we have a lease for fishing on the reservoir, which is on state land. So what's a property right agreement? And the difference between a lease and an agreement. Basically, a lease indicates a schedule of payments, and an agreement may not. Here's our Sand Creek public access area. This is located on the South Dakota-Wyoming border, just south of the town of Beulah. You own some deeded property there, and we also have an agreement with the ranch downstream, be to the north, traveling to the interstate, where we exchange some grazing on Sand Creek to keep the vegetation down, and the owner basically allows fishing access from your deeded all the way to I-80. Significantly increases the amount of access and opportunity for the public. What type of interagency agreements do we have in place? Basically, we have three. They can either be a memorandum of agreement, cooperative agreement, or memorandum of understanding. Basically, it depends on what agency we're dealing with. An example of this is Sinks Canyon outside of Lander. This is an interagency agreement. It's commission-owned land, but it's operated and managed by state parks. Special use permits. Some of you commissioners have seen these before. Basically, we're allowing an activity rather than what that property was acquired for. You hold special use permits on public lands, but we also grant special use permits on commission-owned lands. Examples of what the commission owns are permits on public lands administered by the BLM or the Forest Service. And this allows for various things such as roads, hatcheries, patrol cabins, etc. What's the process for granting special use permits? Basically, if someone wants to do a special use that exceeds 1 year, we bring those in front of the commission for your approval. If it's a one-time use, less than a year, we can go to the appointed commissioner in your district and ask for your approval, not have to come in front of the full commission. The commission does own a significant amount of water rights. A lot of these wildlife habitat management areas were working ranches when they were purchased and had water rights associated to them. So there's a significant amount of work going into maintaining those property rights as well. What's our current internal property right priorities? Number one is definitely securing more public access. 2, trying to pursue conservation easements with the public access component. 3, lands that are immediately adjacent to current commission-owned properties. And 4, taking hold of private holdings within commission-owned lands. Some of these lands have been owned by the commission for 60, 70 years, and there are still a significant amount of private property held within those. So as we move along and take advantage of opportunities, we try to secure those because it would definitely impact areas to be used for critical winter range for animals if someone's driving in and out of there every day. What are some of our current funding sources that we use for lands projects? Obviously, commission funds. We use federal sources such as the Farm Bill. The Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust has been a big partner on many projects. Funding from Governor's Big Game License Coalition. And definitely, we couldn't get much done without our non-governmental organizations such as Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Nature Conservancy, and others. It's truly a partnership approach to lands projects. So getting into a little bit more what John touched on. Basically, the department administers, acquires, and disposes of commission property rights under that said policy. What's the process before it comes to the commission? It can be nominated by any department personnel. It usually gets presented at a region meeting for regional vote. The vote passes. It gets put on our property rights team agenda, which is made up of Meredith Wood, Dirk Miller, Doug Brimmeyer, and myself. If we decide it's okay to move forward on that, we usually meet with the director's office to see their thoughts on the project. And from that point on, it gets put on the commission agenda for authorization to proceed. If we get authorization from you to proceed, that's when the negotiations, appraisal, all that background work takes place. We get our AG involved in the process for review, and then we bring it back to you for final approval. So that's how we do it today. And I should say also that the nomination for property doesn't just have to come from department employees. It can come from public, other government agencies. Doesn't have to be just from within. On the renewal process, so we present things that are currently in place to be renewed, if they're not into perpetuity, to the commission in open session for consideration. And this is kind of what John was touching on about sometimes we bring things back to you for renewal and you give us the okay to proceed, and we're coming back to you for final approval. So for temporary and minor uses, just requires notice to the local commissioner, like I said. That local commissioner can approve that short-term temporary use less than 1 year. And that is what we have for your intro to lands and the process that lands goes through. With that, I would open it up for any questions or discussion commissioners would like to have.
One thing I might add to, you talked about our that we have our own certified real estate appraisers. We also have our own certified land surveyor, which results in a significant cost savings to the agency. We used to handle our own closings. Do we do that still?
President Culver, yes, that's correct. We do have a professional land surveyor on board, and it does speed things along and is a cost savings rather than having to contract all that stuff out. And for example, we just had a closing this week on project approved by the commission in Alpine for disposal of those 17 acres. And yes, Carrie Olson went and handled that closing. So.
That's good. Questions for Scott? So, oh, go ahead, Mark.
I don't understand what we're trying to fix here. You want to cut out one of the steps? Is that the bottom line of this thing, or?
Mr. President, Commissioner Anselmi, no, that's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that there's an opportunity for streamlining this process if the commission so desires. The department will take a look at this. We only bring this up because there's been a lot of questions the last couple of commission meetings as to why the department's coming back to you for the second time on certain projects. And there may not be a way to somehow separate these out. You know, I don't know how we would do that based on the scope of the project. So I guess what the department's recommending is maybe we take a look at it, Commissioner Anselmi, and see if there's some opportunities. And again, Commissioner Culver might have some ideas as well as to how we do that. Maybe we decide here in a couple of weeks that we're not going to do that and that you're comfortable with this policy guidelines, and that's fine.
So I don't think we need a vote, but can we get a consensus from the commission that we direct John and his staff to review the current policy for acquisitions and disposals and see if they can define minor acquisition and disposals and better streamline the process and then bring it back in front of the commission?
I think I would agree with that, Keith.
Okay. Other comments?
Good to me.
Pat?
You know, I hate policies. Policies are worthless. I mean, you know, I think we direct them how to do it. So the reason why, you know, there are rules and regulations which are important. Those have the force and effect of law. Policies are things that we adopt and then usually, it's been my experience, immediately violate because a weird situation comes at us. So I think it's a great idea to look at minor acquisitions and all that. I would not be favorable to go back and amend this and get into all that, but I've been frustrated. Sorry, I had to step out and do some medicine, but I've been frustrated over the years how many times we look at some of these deals. I assume maybe that's the discussion.
It is.
You know, that those oil leases and stuff in the checkerboard by Riverton, we probably looked at those 20 times. I mean, it just got crazy how many times we looked at them, and I don't think the department needs that kind of micromanagement on these minor deals. So I'm all in favor of, you know, you trying to define minor deals, but I'm just not excited about amending this again and doing all that. But
okay.
The rest of the commission probably thinks differently, so I'm okay.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Is there a chance we could just do it a case-by-case basis? That we say we'd like to hear it again or not? I mean, do we have to change anything on paper? If it's a small project and we say, oh no, we're good, just go do it, you wouldn't have to bring it back? But maybe just with each different circumstance, we could address it.
Mr. President, Commissioner Byrd, that may be possible. You know, I think we can go back and take a look at that. What that may require is some initial coordination with the commission, and if you don't want to see that project again, we could just transition into a final approval that day, if you like. So yeah, I think there's flexibility in here, and you know, perhaps Commissioner Craig's right that we don't need to actually go in here and tweak anything. We can get with David DeWald, work with the services division, and maybe we've got the flexibility in here. Guidance is good though for the department on the land acquisition program. The workload, we look at hundreds of projects within the year, certainly, and at times 10 to 15 projects a month as they come in as potential projects. Certainly when you look at the number of folks that approach the commission to move forward on a conservation easement, for example. So the workload is large, and it's good to have some guidance from the commission, which is why we have the policy guidelines, and is also why we've asked for some direction from the commission with respect to priorities for the land acquisition program too. So the property rights team that Scott Cochran talked about needs some guidance, and we can work together to provide that guidance to the property rights team so that we're not just taking every single project to the commission. We're actually screening some of those projects based on your priorities, which is what we think that we need to be doing. So, and I would mention, as we look at this policy guidelines, the priorities that have been communicated by the commission to the department with respect to this program at this time are those projects that involve public access, conservation easements that have a public access element to them, on their own, conservation easements are essentially the acquisition of development rights, and they don't always involve public access. But at times, as we're negotiating those projects, we can work with the landowner to somehow obtain some public access on that property through our work on the conservation easement. And that currently is what the Commission's priority is, as communicated to the department. Third, fee title acquisitions, outright land acquisitions that are adjacent to your wildlife habitat management areas and public access areas, where we can resolve some management issues, if you will, with adjacent landowners. That's where you've asked us to focus our energies for land acquisition. So there's the current priorities that we're working under from the Commission. So you may think about those priorities as we look at these policy guidelines as well, and we can have some informal discussions about this.
Okay, and just a quick note here. I guess I disagree a little bit with Commissioner Crank on policies. I think they're not meant to carry the weight of a regulation. But if we don't document things in policy, then they're only carried in institutional memory and the official minutes, and they're lost to time. So I guess I would like to see all of us review this policy, and if you have ideas or suggestions, work with Mr. Kennedy and we'll take this up at a future point in time.
Mr. President?
Yes.
If I might.
Mark first.
Okay.
I agree with you. I never have read this, so it'll be interesting to read, but I enjoy the two, you come through first for approval, and we go, because it kind of reminds me of what we like. I don't get to Beulah, so you bring this up, and then it kind of gets my mind working about what we have over in Beulah or up by Cody, places I don't, contrary to Mr. Crank, that stuff out in the desert, I kind of like when you come here and tell us about those oil wells out there, but for me, it's just neat. This, you know, it kind of reminds me we have stuff over here. I mean, because we have 166,000, acres and all these other access areas and boat ramps, and now you guys have a lot of. So for me, I like it. That's just my 2 cents.
Commissioner Crank.
Mr. President, maybe this is totally off point, but I was approached in the last week about the Battle Lake is on Highway 70 as you head over the top between Encampment and Bags. Apparently the department has had an interest in obtaining access to that lake for years. So I've been approached by a landowner that wants you to look at Battle Lake. The property that landlocks that has recently come open. So it's kind of in Mr. Anselmi's district, but it's, such as you may have expressed an interest at one time, you ought to look at that. It's online for sale. I don't know if the department has any interest in obtaining that access or not.
Thank you. Anything else?
Mr. President, members of the Commission, thank you. We appreciate your careful review of this. This is an one of your very important programs. We spend a lot of time in this program, so any guidance we can get from you is appreciated. Thank you.
I see that we have been joined by State Treasurer Gordon. Welcome, Mark. Mark, if it's okay with you, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll begin. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes.
As some of you know, for the benefit of the new commissioners, in January we discussed this agenda item with you, and as you can see, we are lucky to have Wyoming State Treasurer Mark Gordon here, and we also had the treasurer at our January commission meeting. The discussion in January involved draft legislation that was moving through the legislative process at the time. It involves an act that created a Pool A investment account that would allow the investment of certain funds to have more diversification and perhaps get a higher return. The fund that it involves in terms of the commission is the commission's trust fund with a corpus of about $28 million. And it would allow approximately, or I think maybe specifically 70%, up to 70% of that corpus to be invested in a way that Treasurer Gordon will go over with you in just a minute. At the time, we were being specifically requested by the Joint Appropriations Committee as to whether or not the Commission wanted to be involved in this piece of legislation, and in fact, the Commission expressed some concerns about that. That bill continued to move forward despite the Commission's concerns about being involved in it at the time, and in fact, the Commission is still named even after the act was finalized, and you're still involved. The Commission's trust fund is still involved in that act today. And again, Treasurer Gordon can go over that with us in just a little bit. In January, the Commission agreed to support being included in that act and in this investment strategy with two conditions. One, if the percent invested in the equities could be determined by the Commission, and secondly, if the Commission could have the option to remove your trust fund, the amount of your trust fund that was being invested, if the return over a 5-year period was equal to or less than that earned as the fund is currently invested.
Can I correct you on that? That motion did not carry. That was the motion that was made, but it failed. Am I correct?
It did not fail. I looked at the minutes yesterday, and that is included in the final motion.
I don't think so, Mr. John. I
Check
think
on that?
motion failed, I'm quite sure.
We'll take a look at that. At any rate, so regardless, those special conditions are not included in any of the act at this point anyways. So it's a dialogue between the Commission and State Treasurer Gordon, and we can get into that right now. And as I go sit down, I'll look at those minutes from that January Commission meeting and confirm that for us.
Thank you.
With that, Treasurer Gordon, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. My memory is like yours. I think that motion did fail as I remember it, but we'll see what the minutes say. My purpose, Mr. Chairman, today, since I note that there are some new commissioners, and I know you had important work that you did yesterday. First off, let me thank you for that great work you did yesterday.
Oh, yeah. We'll
so, well, I know it was important, and I, as a Wyoming citizen and a hunter, I really appreciate the work you put in. But I thought what I'd do, Mr. Chairman, is just briefly review a little bit of what the circumstances were, the conversation we had, how the legislation proceeded, who you're now embedded with in Pool A, and then most importantly, I wanted to just tell you kind of our process and how we anticipate moving forward, and give you the opportunity to ask any questions you might have. I will apologize a little bit. I am not a proficient PowerPoint provider, and so I put together the slides you have before you. They're kind of cobbled from a couple of other presentations we had. But let me just begin and explain a little bit about what the state agency pool is and what Pool A is. So as many of you know, the state has several funds. They have permanent funds, and we aren't talking about those. There's a workers' compensation fund, and then virtually everything else that the state does, all the operating funds, virtually are in what is called the state agency pool. Michael Walden Newman, former CIO, used to talk about that as the state's checkbook. So I'll give you a couple of ideas of your trust fund was in there. The Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust was in there. The Wyoming Department of Transportation Trust is in there. All of the income and spending accounts for the various permanent funds are in there. The famous rainy day account, legislative stabilization reserve account, all told comes up to about about a $6 billion fund, a little bit less than that. And it, by the Constitution, could only invest in fixed income securities. Now, back in the 1980s, and you can say if I'm boring you, but back in the 1980s, interest rates were up in the 14% range, 12 to 13, 14, 15% range, and they've come down progressively ever since with a little bump in 93 and 94, but they're down right around 2% right now. And some of that is related to what the Federal Reserve has done. Some of that is related to markets. But the real concern we had was expressed last year when President Trump came into office, because immediately, first off, the Federal Reserve raised rates, but people's anticipations of the economy getting stronger, regulation, tax reform, etc., raised rates pretty substantially. That's a problem for the state agency pool. And it's a problem for the state agency pool because of this. And that is that if you hold a security that you bought at a 2% interest rate, and the rate then goes up to 2.5%, why in the world would you want to buy somebody's 2% when you could buy a freshly issued 2.5? Unless they gave you a discount. So you can see why the amount in the state agency pool, we were very concerned that the corpus value would decrease. And in fact, it has. Now, one of the measures of risk that you can apply to that is something called duration. And as duration extends, duration is basically a measure that says for every 1% jump in that rate that's paid, you'll lose roughly whatever that duration number is. So 6% was what we were exposed to in the fall. Since that time, we've taken a number of actions to reduce that duration down to about 3. But we want to be very cautious about doing that because, you know, 10-year bond rates were at 2.8 not too long ago, and Mark, you probably know this, but they went down to 2.20 earlier this week. And now the economy, while the general world economy seems to be improving and our own economy seems to be doing well, you all know this because you hear every day, well, let's see, the Philadelphia Fed's manufacturing index has missed 3 times. That's unique. That's really bad. Housing purchases are the highest they've been. Nobody can really track what's going on. It's a little hard to know how this administration is going to fare against Congress and whether these reforms are going to be quickly coming through. And the only tool that the Federal Reserve had was what has been done in Europe, which was, okay, we'll just keep reducing rates and hopefully more money will go out and maybe that'll stimulate the economy. And if the rates went negative, you know, then the problem is it's sort of like putting your money in the bank and then continuing to pay the bank to hold your money, and you just hold it there because you want it to be safe. So it's really unclear whether we're going to see rates rise or we're going to see them go negative. So for us, we've been very cautious about making sure that we've been very protective, and that's the state agency pool. Over the long haul, one of the best protections against that has been if you can have some equity that will cover some of the inflationary gains that you can get. And that's the reason why we pushed for the passage of Constitutional Amendment A, and that's in fact what came about as part of Pool A. There was a discussion last January, and we spent a lot of time in front of this commission, and thank you very much for that time, because it's been our contention in the Treasurer's office that we wanted to make sure that anybody that was put into that pool actually knew what was going to happen to them, which is why we met with the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, why we met with the Cultural Resource Trust, and the matching fund for the public TV. Those all seemed like great candidates. They meant to have trust mandates, and they had boards that understood what the risks were associated with that. You all were were voluntarily put forward. There was a lot of conversation. I know this board had a long conversation about whether this was a good or a bad thing. What we wanted to do with Pool A, and then I'll go through who your other compatriots are and how we're going to do this. Our intent with Pool A was to have a tool for those funds, parts of the state agency pool, which could benefit from having some equity. And equity does have a certain amount of risk to it. So the way people constantly used to think about it was equity is risky, bonds are safe, but we now know that both are very risky. And our desire going forward was to make sure we had a diversified portfolio that would meet your needs, and all the participants being extremely prudent and thoughtful about how we did that. You voted against it, as I remember. Maybe the minutes were right. Okay. But as the legislature sometimes does, they have better ideas than us, and so you are there now fully in Pool A, and my purpose for being here today is basically to assure you that we are not going to put you at risk. You are in Pool A, and let's. I can click this, right? We'll get there in just a sec. So Pool A has, at this point, it has 5 funds in it. It has and the vehicle we're holding it under is the old Wyoming Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund. We did that just for internal purposes because, building new accounts and new systems around it were complicated, whereas this seemed the appropriate vehicle. The Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, the Cultural Trust Fund, the Public Television Matching Fund account, and your trust. So what I wanted to bring to your attention is that this is the first time that we've had Pool A, and I'm about to show you what the asset allocation is. In March, the State Loan and Investment Board met and passed asset allocations across the board. And we will continue probably in March to review asset allocations and look at those and pass those in March. There is an investment policy which we will pass most likely in June. That will have some other provisions in it. But let me just kind of walk you up through what those asset allocations are and then tell you kind of how we're planning to move. Rest assured, we are going to be very, very slow in making the changes. So the asset allocation that where do I point? I hope so. You're going the right way. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with the state agency pool. This is what the asset allocation you currently hold is, and it is the asset allocation that you will continue with for a certain amount, and you would have been under any circumstances. In it, we have convertibles, we have internal fixed income fund. We have built capacities in the Treasurer's office to manage probably about 10% of the fixed income. That's really important because it allows us to help reduce the duration. We have a low duration fixed income externally managed account. We have a series of bank loans, some emerging market debt, TIPS, which are inflation linked securities that are meant to react quickly if there's a big bump in inflation, and then a certain amount of cash. Pool A investments account, you'll note, is a little bit more rich. So you'll have, and just so you can see the long-term target, we'll move towards, there'll be a minimum and a maximum range. Right now, those minimum and maximum ranges are a little wider than they probably will be. And they're important because when you have an asset allocation, markets move. Sometimes the stock market might move up quickly. Sometimes the bond market might do particularly well. It's really important that a person get disciplined, that when you're outside of your asset allocation, that you take and recover the capital gains and bring yourself back into what your mix is. And we'll talk a little bit about what that mix is. But anyway, long story. The broad U.S. equity, about 7.5%. Small cap U.S. equity, about 1%. Broad international equity, 7.5%. Preferred stock, and I have some slides at the end of the presentation that will tell you a little bit about what preferred stock is. It's kind of a hybrid sort of stock. It's intended to produce more income, more dividend income. This is one of the features of this is a new asset class for us, generally in the office. It's more protected in the capital stack. So a preferred stock gets honored more quickly than common stock does. So it's a more secure and safe type of stock to have. Another instrument that we're adding is with MLPs. Those are also, we can walk through those a little bit. These are called master limited partnerships. They're things like pipelines that have both a income generating capacity in the sense that in a pipeline, product has to move through it regardless of whether the stock market's up or down. They have performed well under most scenarios. You continue to get the interest income on them and the rental payments, but the capital volatility, the actual value of the stock may change a little bit, but it's also considered to be a more protected type of asset. And then a lot of the more conservative things, internal duration, bank loans, emerging market debt, and TIPS. And one of the challenges we had when we reduced our duration was how do we keep the same interest coming back to the state? And part of that is by extending our credit purchases. So things like bank loans and other things like that. What this chart is, and these are available on the Treasurer's website that we passed. They're also available on the Office of Surface Lands and Investments website. They're Board Matters D in the March meeting. What we have here is, we're really talking about Pool A, and we'll go back to state agency pool in just a second. This is a curve that's called the efficient frontier. So we have all of the asset classes that we saw. We look at the mixes that we can have, and we run those through various stress tests, and we come up with what we consider to be, the optimal mix. And on the x-axis, you have a measure of how much risk you're taking, and on the y-axis, you have a measure of what the return most likely would be. Now, most of the time, these are regressional analyses. So you're really looking historically at how things have performed in various climates over the last 10 years or so. And you then pick a portfolio. Each of the numbers, each of the spots on that horizon represents a likely portfolio, and then you'll see we've modeled how they perform. You'll see what the current target is, what the potential long-term target is. You can see how we're going to move over time. And by over time, I mean this is probably more like 6 months to a year. And we aren't going to do it unless we have the right circumstances, because one of the big concerns, and it's a huge concern for the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, is we want to make sure that the corpuses that are built in, that don't have income generated from other sources, that corpus doesn't diminish because we're trying to take extra risk and get more return. So it's a very cautious move, probably 6 months to a year. And then let me sort of walk through this chart, which is also there. This gives you what the current target is, the potential long-term target, the difference there. And you can see as we go down to sort of what you'll see portfolio stress testing, Monte Carlo results. That's about midway down through that chart. We took 2008 as an event that would be kind of a worst case. We've also modeled this with stagflation in 93, 94. We actually now internally in the Treasurer's Office have the ability to build scenarios, and in future commission meetings, maybe these are things you would want to entertain. What happens if the bond market falls apart? What happens if we have a 20% drop in stocks? And we can kind of tell you what the likelihood of how the portfolio will perform. As you can see, we move from a median one-year return of 3.6, I think it is, I've got this down here, up to 4.4. So obviously the return is better. But what about the risk that's associated with that? And you can see that there is a one-year maximum drawdown right above the median one-year return. So you can see we're taking we're getting we're adding a pretty substantial amount of income, almost $1 million of income. And the maximum worst case scenario is there's a little bit more risk of 2.1 million. We think that's a good risk to take. And then below there you can see the probabilities of what the return will be over time. Are there any questions on that? Yes.
How much money, like you said, you could gain 3.6 million. How much is in there?
All told at this point, let's see. Tobacco settlement is 84 million. The Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust is 104 million. The Wyoming Cultural Resource Trust is 15 million. Public television is 3 million, and you have 28,679,0882. So
32 cents. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Mark, who makes the decision to move? I mean, is it you as treasurer, or is it the State Loan and Investment Board? Who is going to, over the next 6 months to a year, make these decisions to go to these different risk profiles?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Crank, when we set the asset allocation, it then falls to the Treasurer's Office to implement that asset allocation.
And as I understand your statement, the asset allocation was set in March already, correct?
That is correct.
So you'll implement it based on your discretion and the risk profile you see over the next 6 months to a year?
That's correct. It will be done, Commissioner Crank, within the limitations of that target. We are not going to actively trade up and down and all that sort of stuff. It's a very methodical approach that we're taking.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
And we're always available for phone calls, and any activity that we do will be available on our website.
Will the same investments be made with regard to all the different participants in Pool A?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Crank, that is in fact the case. The challenge we had as an office in trying to implement custom mandates would have been more than our office could have undertaken. And I think to some degree, we've, to digress just a second, Mr. President, that we have undertaken to bring the level of expertise in our office up substantially. So we have added staff, that's one. Two, and Commissioner Crank, you'll know that there are 5 politicians that are in charge of this portfolio now. We
love you, but the rest of them terrify us.
So we took the step of putting in place an investment committee that will help advise. And the people that go on that investment committee, the treasurer is on it, and that investment committee will now have 3 members that are chosen kind of at a 2 arms length, 2 arms length style. Each member of the State Loan and Investment Board will put forward a member of the selection panel, and that selection panel will then pick from nominees, people that put themselves forward for the investment committee, and those members on that investment committee will serve 3-year terms rotating. But here are the things. The qualifications are that you have to have at least 7 years of experience in institutional investing with a portfolio of $500 million or more. 2, you cannot have conflicts. And 3, you would know probably as well as anybody what the term moral turgitude would be.
Moral turpitude.
Turpitude, there we go. So in other words, you have to be clean and not a criminal. And then general financial acumen. What we wanted to do was to bring a level of expertise from really, it's amazing how many people, and you would know this as a commission better than anyone, how many people love Wyoming and how many people are willing to serve Wyoming in that capacity. So that board will also assist in that decision-making process as we go forward. We wanted to make sure we had a credible professional backdrop to be able to make those kinds of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a new thing going forward. And just finally, what I do is these are, we spoke about each of the points along that efficient frontier. This is the blend of the asset mix that would go into that. And you can see all the relative returns, the drawdowns, etc. That's for your own ability to look as you go forward. Just for the sake of reference, this is what state agency pool does. You'll see, because it's only invested in bonds, the amount of risk that you can take on for the amount of return just is not worth it. So we actually are trying to, currently you'll see the green over on the right, that's the amount of risk that we were at, that's the return we were anticipating getting. We're moving that down because we are very, very concerned about what's going to happen in the bond market over the next year to 2. Again, the same charts, you can walk through those just to sort of understand what we're working at. And then I've added some definitions about MLPs for information. Concentrations, you can see the types of things that are MLPs. They're relatively inexpensive right now. These are the correlation analyses, Sharpe ratios if you want to spend your time looking at that, returns and so on. And then just for reference, I wanted to let you know about the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, the Higher Education Endowment Fund, the Permanent Fund, the University Land Fund. You can see these are the asset allocations that were put forward. You might also be interested in the Workers' Compensation Fund. We took some pretty substantial steps there, and the reason we did is because we can take a lot of risk off the table. So the Workers' Compensation Fund is in very good shape. So. With that, Mr. President, and then as I said, I added the preferred stock so you can have a narrative about that. I would stand for any questions. The things that I wanted to leave with you is that the state agency pool we're very concerned about. That bond market and what's going to happen, whether interest rates go up or they go down, Both of them have negative implications for the state agency pool. So being very careful in managing that's going to be important. That is the asset allocation you have currently. As we begin to move, as markets may improve, we have I think one of the things I mentioned in January is that generally speaking, equity markets at their highest valuation since the 1930s. 1929. So buying aggressively now just doesn't make sense. There may be a correction. We're very long in the tooth on the current bull market. So we if we have a correction, we may move somewhat expeditiously there. But the point I want to give you is that we're being very cautious in how we move. We're building this out. And I want to actually provide the invitation if you want us to show up at any time, give you kind of performance numbers. There are two types of performance numbers you'll be starting to see. One is monthly on our website. You'll see kind of the pool basis of that, and you can kind of prorate that by the percent that your fund's involved. And then quarterly, we have an independent consultant that is meant to correlate that. So with that, Mr. President, questions?
Pete, could you go over again the actual people responsible for managing this fund and
Sure.
how that is carried out through time? I mean, you're not going to be the state treasurer forever, and how long that board is. So, if it's going to remain relatively consistent on who's giving the advice, or if it's going to be up and down every couple of years, it's going to turn over or what?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner Doobie. Before I answer that question, the one last thing I wanted to say is that Pool A does have a top equity, and this is a difference. The old statute for the permanent funds talked about common stock. We moved it to equity. So the maximum amount of equity that this fund could ever have is 70%. You'll notice we're substantially shy of that. But to your point, Commissioner Doobie, here's how the investment process works. The State Loan and Investment Board, all 5 electeds, are in charge of setting the asset allocation and also establishing annually the investment policy and sub policies for each of the funds. Beyond that, and then is the purview of the Treasurer's Office to administer those funds. So once those asset allocations are set, and those asset allocations are set with the help of an independent qualified financial consultant. In this case, it's RVK, which has been the consultant for the state for a long time. When we get down to the state treasurer, there is a CIO and an investment function that will deal with the choices about when to move into assets, when to move out, the directives, rebalancing the portfolio, etc. On the other side, there's a back office component that often gets lost in the sort of paperwork because the back office actually executes all of those commands and directives and so on. That all is under the purview of the treasurer. What we did, the step we added was this investment committee. And the point of the investment committee was to address that very point. You do have changes in the elected officials. You have changes in the treasurer. So this investment committee is intended to bring some stability to that. So the members on the investment committee are going to be the treasurer and one of his appointees, the CIO of the retirement fund, and these 3 independently selected people with experience. And they will serve 3-year terms and rotate over time. They can be removed for cause by the selection committee or by the governor. Then there are 2 observers, for lack of a better phrase, ex officios, that don't have voting capacity, one from the Management Council and one from the Governor's Office. But the intent there, and the reason why I was so much in favor of it, the intent there was that treasurers should have the ability to make changes, but they should be able to shine under all circumstances. If they really wanted to torpedo the thing, they've got to work extra hard. So that's really the intent of that investment committee. The other thing that I think will improve is that the investment committee, with that level of experience, will help to advise and set the asset allocations, which is important because currently, and I think Commissioner Crank, you know this, that when an investment consultant sets your asset allocation and helps to choose your asset managers, it's just the nature of the business. They're going to be extremely conservative, and in that sense, they're going to be conservative in the sense that they want to make sure that people know the names, that they are big firms, etc. And one of the problems that you have with that is they're household names, but they're very expensive names. And one of the biggest challenges we've had in performance has been the amount of fees we have paid. And so having a consultant that does something, let me put it this way, having an asset allocation that we develop that is then weighed against a consultant, that'll allow the consultant to do a much less prejudiced job on how they grade the performance of that. If you're making a suggestion, your inclination is to say, well, we made that suggestion, and it was a pretty good suggestion. In this case, what we want to make them do is to give us the best advice they have. Does that help? Okay.
Other questions? Mark, so it's my understanding that our Wildlife Trust Fund, it sets somewhere in the vicinity of $28 million. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President, as of yesterday, the numbers I had were $28,679,8.82.
Okay, now, unless this commission decides otherwise, that money will stay in the state agency pool as it currently is, correct?
Mr. President, no, that is not what the law says. That's why I'm here today. The law says you are moved over to Pool A.
Wow.
So you are in Pool A, which is the reason why I wanted to communicate with you exactly what we're doing and get your feedback.
Somehow I kind of thought we'd have some say-so in that, but okay, what authority does the commission have in regard to this money?
The conversation, and I think Deputy Kennedy, you were there, I think, for some of that. The conversation was essentially the treasurer should talk to you. Is that a fair characterization?
So how much flexibility do we have then?
Mr. Chair, I guess my view would be the flexibility in inter-year is really not there. But I want to make sure that as we come to asset allocation and setting the guidelines and all of those things, that we have your full input.
I thought the legislation stated that we may invest this, but, okay. There's
Chair,
no sense to rehash that, I guess, but.
So bring that up.
Mr. Chair, I'm looking at Chapter 91, and it reads, there is created the Pool A investment account, the state treasurer or his designee, which shall be registered under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, blah, blah, blah. Talks about the earnings from the monies invested in Pool A investment account may invest up to 70% of the monies comprising the Pool A investment account in equities including stocks of corporations. The State Loan and Investment Board, in consultation with the state agency or agencies receiving or administering investment earnings from the monies invested in Pool A investment account shall annually review the state investment policy statements for the investment pool created by this subsection as required under 94716. Monies in the following funds shall be invested in the Pool A investment account, the Wyoming Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund, the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust account, the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund established under 922304, Wyoming Public Television Matching Fund, the trust account within the Wyoming Game and Fish Fund created by 231501F.
May invest up to 70%.
May invest up to 70%.
Help me out here, Meredith. Help me understand.
Mr. President, I think Mark just read that later on it says our funds shall be in this account, right?
President Culver, I think to simplify it a little bit, the may invest is up to the Treasurer's Office. The annual requirement to coordinate with the owners of those pools would be that annual requirement, and then that the Commission's trust fund corpus shall be a part of the up to 70% invested. Correct?
Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're in it. Good luck, Mark.
So, excuse my ignorance coming in late on the ballgame on this. So, I mean, are we in this forever? I mean, how does this work? I apologize for my ignorance, so maybe you guys already know, but I'm just curious if we have no choice in being in the fund. Do we have any choice of using that money sometime in the near future or distant future?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Commissioner Dubey, whether you're, I guess, to be a candidate for this, you had to pass a 2/3 vote to get into the fund. Our intent here was not one of generating enormous returns and taking lots of risks. That's what I was trying to convey. Our intent here was to have something that would be actually probably little more secure than even the state agency pool, and that's the way we intend to prosecute it. I think if I understand the way this goes, the department incurs costs for supportive service. So your 200 series, which are operating expenses, supportive services are the 200 series, grants and aid payments are 600 series, capital outlay 700 series, and professional services and contracts 900 series. All of those come out of this account, as I understand correctly. Is that right? Is that?
I don't know if you understand that.
Yeah. You are the only candidate in this pool that has, excuse me, you are Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. Their personnel come out of this fund, and that would be a concern down the road.
Yes, Mark, I have a question. Are we able to draw from this fund if need be?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, yes. I mean, nothing else is different in the way it's administered. As you need to draw on it. We maintain balances, and so nothing is changed in terms of the administration of it. The point I wanted to make is that here's how we're prosecuting it. Here are the challenges we see going forward, and then just to relay to you the information.
And we cannot draw from the corpus of the fund. We can only draw from the earnings on the fund.
Yeah. Okay.
President Culver, Commissioner Dubey, and Rael, if you'll recall, Section F of 501 is the corpus portion only. That's what is being included in this. The interest drawn off of that by statute gets deposited into our Game and Fish Operating Fund, which is distributed annually during the budget process. That is not changing. So the interest earned, regardless of the investment pool that they choose to apply this, our $28.5 million to, the Commission will still have the opportunity to distribute that interest as presented by the department or recommended by the Commission. So the interest portion we would still have access to, like we would continue to have access to. The corpus, the 28.5, will remain in the corpus. It's inviolate, commission, and no one else by statute can expend that. It can only be invested.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Meredith, remind me, last year we decided not to spend that interest. Is that correct?
President Culver and Commissioner Crank, no, that's the lifetime license fund, and that's a separate agenda item this afternoon, or I don't know what time it is, coming up.
Okay.
But the interest on the trust, the lifetime license account that we're talking about, they're two separate accounts.
All right, and what additions will there be to the corpus as we go forward? I mean, what generated this 28 million that Mark is now managing and investing for us?
Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, the corpus for our Wyoming Game and Fish Trust Fund is made up of 50% of lifetime conservation stamp revenue and 33.5% of annual conservation stamp revenue plus donations.
Okay, so the corpus will continue to grow as we go forward.
That's correct.
And hopefully under Mark's incredible tutelage, our income will grow as well, which we can spend for whatever we want to.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Very good. Other questions for Mark? We really appreciate you coming today and helping us to understand this, and I'm sure we'll be visiting with you in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll make sure, Mr. President, that we get to you in the fall, tell you how the performance has been, and get your input before before we set the next asset allocation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so next up, Meredith.
I think Cochran has a couple of lands things. Do you want to put that at the bottom or? No.
Number 12. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped right over agenda item number 12. Mr. Cochran. Thank you.
No, mine either. We could transfer a little over. Is it okay maybe?
President Culver, Commissioners, Director Talbot, we have 4 items to discuss today for land, and these are all asking for your authorization to proceed. We'll start with number 8, the Sunlight Basin Wildlife Habitat Management Area Power Line Easement. This project consists of an already existing underground power line easement, which we will have to ask to abandon in exchange for granting a new easement for an underground power line easement to the facilities at Sunlight Basin. Basically, this power line that's currently there is out of date, a hazard, and needs to be replaced. This will cost about $12,000, which has been approved within our FY17 Habitat and Access budget. And the department is recommending to the Commission vote to authorize to proceed with negotiations with Rocky Mountain Power for the new buried power line easement.
So this is a good example of what we were discussing before. Today we're doing an authorization to proceed, and you're going to have to come back to us next meeting with an authorization to acquire. And under current policy, we don't have the authority. We cannot just take care of this in one meeting. It'll have to come back again. But
President Culver, you are correct. I do not know the answer if we'd have to come back or.
Okay. Any questions for Scott? May I have a motion?
What, Mr. President, I mean, Mr. Kennedy's approaching. I think maybe he has a different thought on whether we need to do this in 2 pieces.
Mr. President, members of the commission, I think that based on a discussion with David DeWald, you may have the discretion to approve this today. But if you'd like, we'll go back, we'll take a look at, per your previous direction, we'll take a look at that policy guidelines and we'll make sure. Does that sound like a good approach?
I haven't honestly looked at the issue.
Okay, so if it's okay with you, we'll take another look at it and hopefully we'll be able to streamline this and not have this occur in the future so that the commission can, as Commissioner Byrd brought up earlier, we can deal with these things perhaps on a case-by-case basis and get these approved right at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. President, I would move that we give the department authority to proceed with the negotiations to obtain this easement and get rid of the old easement.
Second?
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Crank, seconded by Commissioner Anselmi. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam, how do we move to the next?
That's right at the top up here. Talk about item B.
B?
That what you're talking about?
Yeah, move to B. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Thank you.
Authorization to proceed.
So these next two will be exactly how the first one was. They're all power. These first three are all power line easements. Unfortunately, we were unable to do item B at the last commission meeting when we talked about South Park. Apologies for that. YDOT did not have you together, but regardless of that, item B is South Park Wildlife Habitat Management Area. As you remember, they're having a construction project south of Jackson on the highway. This construction will basically require the existing power lines that are above ground along the highway to be removed. We're asking to grant a new easement to Lower Valley Energy to eliminate those power poles and grant them a new buried power line easement to move those lines off the right of way. Physical impact is yet to be determined, but we're asking the department is recommending to the commission to vote to authorize to proceed with negotiations with Lower Valley Energy for the new buried power line easement on South Park Wildlife Habitat Management Area.
Any go ahead, Maura.
Use your ray gun and show me what's happening here.
Mr. President, Commissioner Anselmi, this is the highway coming south out of Jackson. This is the shooting range, which they have a special use permit with the department for part of it being on commission-owned land. The dotted line here is the existing power line. That would be removed. They'd be changing it into a buried in the blue.
So you think we're going to have to pay for this? Whose idea was it to take down the poles and put the buried?
Basically for wildlife values, Commissioner Anselmi, and to my knowledge, there is no, I don't know about the financials. I'd have to ask Sean. Stuff out of the room.
Well, this is far going to the shooting range.
Yes, that's correct.
We don't have anything over there. Of our
No.
stuff.
There is it didn't show on this map, we do have a Quonset that power would be ran to that as well, where there is no power as part of this project. Basically, that would be to provide water to horses, department horses. Otherwise, mainly this project's for providing power to the Jackson Hole shooting range.
Mr. President?
Commissioner Crank.
Did you say something about, is it YDOT forcing the power line off their access, off their right of way? Did I hear that or did I make that up in my mind?
Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, I think that's what YDOT would like to see happen, is moving them out of the way.
So the question I have is why isn't YDOT paying for this, or why isn't the Jackson Hole shooting range paying for it? I mean, I don't have any problem with giving you authority to proceed, but
I'll have Sean answer that question for you, Commissioner Crank.
Sorry, I'm late. I was on an important phone call. What's the question?
We're wondering why, is YDOT forcing the power line off of their right-of-way for the highway? Is that why we're being put this issues in front of us? And secondly, if the primary purpose of the new power line is to help the Jackson Hole shooting range, which just has a special use permit with us, why aren't they paying for it? Or why is, if YDOT is truly forcing this power line off their right-of-way, why aren't they paying for the new, any fiscal costs associated with moving this power line and burying it?
I actually do not know the answer to that question at the moment. I came into this project towards the end of it, and I believe Brian Rognan was the lead on it. As far as the easement goes with the money, I'm assuming that it's an improvement for the gun club, and if they're the beneficiary to that, we could certainly speak with them about payment, and we could get back to you on that.
Okay. Mr. President?
Yes.
I need a lot more information on this before I guess we finalize this, but they're coming back to us anyway, so I would move that we give them authority to proceed, but answer those questions. I mean, what is the fiscal cost, who's going to pay, and why should we be responsible for the payment of the fiscal cost?
Very good. Can I have a second?
Second.
Aileen seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried.
President Culver, the commission will get back to you on that information when we bring this back to you. Moving on to line item B. This is for our Boulder rearing station. Another power line easement. The Boulder rearing station is located in the Pinedale region. Basically, we're trying to upgrade the system, the electric service that serves the facility. Rearing station personnel have been in contact with Rocky Mountain Power about preliminary talks to install a new single-phase 12240 volt overhead power line from the main transmission line to the facility. The budget for this project is $8,297, which has been approved within the FY17 Fish Division budget. The department has recommended the commission to vote to authorize the department to proceed with negotiations with Rocky Mountain Power for an overhead power line easement to the Boulder rearing station.
Questions? Yep, Mark.
How are they getting their power now? You know?
Mr. President, Commissioner Anselmi, Dirk Miller would be the best to answer that question.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot, Commissioner Anselmi, this is a new location that we don't have power on. So this is a spot where we're trying to raise some of the three species, the bluehead sucker, flannelmouth sucker, round-tailed chub. We've been raising them over there on this pond. Right here, we put a couple we built this little pond up off those springs, have run water there. We just need to have some power there to try to do a little better job raising them. So this is, we're paying them to extend a power line to a place we don't have it. So anyway, we need to give them an easement to build a power line for us, which seems a bit crazy to me, but that's how that works.
So the power will be used to pump water or generate oxygen, or?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
We probably won't generate oxygen there, but we'll use aeration. But we need electricity for some pumping and for some aeration. And it's just on the map. If the scale of the map is probably over here above Meredith's head, is about where the Boulder hatchery is. The river kind of runs along here, and the hatchery's over to the west from here. It's a pretty simple project.
Questions?
No, we're getting back to I don't know this time. Maybe you could tell the new commissioners why you're doing the bluehead sucker, how this all came about, whether It's this big sandy project, and can you give us 25 words or less, or?
I was going to say that's a 20-minute talk.
I was going to say, because we are running a little short
Okay,
on
I'm
time,
sorry.
but
Would you like to have an update on that at another time, or would you like a?
Yeah, maybe another time, I'm sorry, but yeah, they're working on taking some fish out of the Big Sandy River and keeping them, because those are threatened species, the way I understand it. And poisoning the river and then putting these back, because is that kind of the long and short of it, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word poison, but yes, sir, we are treating the river to remove non-native fish and to restore and conserve the native fish community that could be petitioned for listing. I think that was less than 25 words.
That's great, thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.
Any other discussion? If not, can I have a motion, please?
I would so move.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Crank and seconded by Commissioner Anselmi. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you. Last item, D, it's our East Casper Game Warden Station disposal. The commission acquired a new East Casper Game Warden Station in March of 2016 from the Frank C. Layton Marital Trust. This map is showing the location of the previous warden station on Poplar Street. We're hoping to get approval to move forward with the disposal process on this game warden station. What we're proposing is bid information to be proposed to the public, advertised, and bid results, once obtained, would be brought to the commission for your approval to award to the successful bidder. It's a one-story ranch home built in 1956 with 1,240 square feet, and it's been valued by the Natrona County Assessor at approximately $160,000. Fiscal impact for proceeding with this to the department would be cost for appraisal and advertising for the bid process, which would be roughly $2,000. We're asking the commission to vote to authorize the department to proceed with negotiations for the disposal of the East Casper Game Warden Station located on South Poplar Street.
Questions? Mike?
Scott, is that typically how these properties are disposed of, is through a auction process versus using a real estate agent, or?
Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, yes, that's correct.
Okay. And what is the purpose for that? Is it just a quicker process to get it done, or?
Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, I would imagine it would be to be as fair as possible to the public and have it be a sealed process.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. President, and maybe Mr. DeWald knows, but I think it's statutory. We have to dispose of government property. You have to go through a bid process. I mean, so statutorily, we're directed to do it this way. Is that right, Mr. DeWald?
Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, I think you're correct.
Thank you. Other questions?
Mr. President, so we have to accept the high bid no matter what? Is that how that works, or does it have to be a percentage of the value, or?
Mr. President, Commissioner Doobie, I think what happens is, well, I know that through the bid process, I'd have to look at the policy to be absolutely sure, but I think we have to have meet appraised value at a minimum. So even though we get bids, if they don't meet that, you're not required to accept.
So we need an authorization to proceed with the disposal.
I would so move.
Mike Schmidt moved, second.
Second.
Galen. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Meredith. So while she's coming up here, I guess it's my intention, we're a little bit behind schedule, but if it's all right with everybody, we'll just continue working on through the agenda without a lunch break and finish up for the day. Is that okay?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Works for me.
What time is it?
Mr. President, Commissioners, Director Talbot, I'm back in front of you again today like I was last year. to talk about your authority under Wyoming Statute 23-1-501 Part C. And that is the commission each year has the authority to approve up to 6% of the balance of that fund, which is our lifetime license fund, to move that up to 6% into our operating fund to be basically available to the commission's discretion for expenses. So the current balance of the fund as of the end of March is $5.8 million. We anticipate that going up slightly. We project it going up to about 5.9 by the end of this fiscal year. And so 6% of that would be $354,000. So we would like to request that the commission consider the transfer of up to 6%, $354,000 to the operating fund as of the end of June balance.
Mr. President.
Commissioner Crank.
So, as you know, I've been out of commission for a while, but we had a budget committee. I believe it was you, Mr. Culver, myself, and Charles Price.
Right.
Has, in my absence, has the budget committee met and discussed potential movement of these funds, or do we need to do that, or?
I've had discussions with Meredith and Mr. Kennedy, but no, the budget committee, which is now comprised of you, I, and Commissioner Anselmi, has not officially met and discussed this. I might clarify a little bit for some of a year ago, we chose not to transfer this money. We chose to leave that in the corpus, and but a year ago we were kind of in a different situation. We had somewhere in the vicinity of $64 million in our operating fund, and since then we've taken approximately half of that money and put it in an emergency reserve. We also invested a considerable amount of money in capital construction projects. This year we don't have the luxury of that kind of money in our operating account. So I would urge the commission to move to transfer this money to our operating account this year.
Mr. President, if I might, and Meredith, I don't know if you're prepared to do this, but my memory was what we put $36 million in reserve, correct?
President Culver, Commissioner Crank, 31.5.
$31.5 million, and the idea was that would allow the commission, in a worst case scenario, if we received no revenue whatsoever, we could continue to operate for 6 months. That was approximately half of our yearly budget. So that, I assume that $31.5 million still remains in reserve.
Commissioner Crank, it does.
Has it grown? I mean, has it, where are we at in, if we were to look at that reserve account today, can you tell me what it would be?
So President Culver, Commissioner Crank, if you recall those conversations, we always have to look at that operating fund balance as of the end of the fiscal year. So the $64 million that President Culver mentioned earlier is the balance as it was at the end of FY16, 6/30/2016. If we were to look at the balance as of right now, today, as you're all aware, you talked about all those season setting, there's a huge draw coming up. There is a significant amount of money in that account at this point. And until those draws are conducted and all those refunds are made,
It wouldn't worth looking at.
it's not worth looking at. That's why we always have to look at that specific date.
Is there a critical time, I mean, is there a drop dead time when we need to decide whether to transfer this 300 and some odd thousand to our general, to our operating budget? Or, I mean, does it have to be done today, or could it be done at a subsequent meeting? Or I just don't know enough to make a valid decision. If we're still flush, I haven't known about what our Pittman-Robertson balances are, and I don't know if the new commissioners have discussed Pittman-Robertson and where we may be with that. I know there was a panic that we might elect Hillary Clinton, so I assume there was huge gun sales and ammunition sales that would have increased our potential Pittman-Robertson funds, and now we have President Trump. I've been out of touch. I don't know what all those are, and that's my fault, being on the budget committee, but I just like more information before we decide whether to keep this in reserve, which increases the interest for future years, or spend it this year. So is there a drop dead date when we have to do that?
President Culver, Commissioner Crank, maybe I can break that up into a couple of different pieces. You don't have to do that today. The commission has one shot per fiscal year to do that. So Up until the end of June, you can make that decision. After June, we can't go back and transfer this 6% from this fiscal year and also consider 6% from next fiscal year. So the amount that was retained in the lifetime license fund that you did not transfer last year, that 6% can never be moved from that account. So that's the answer as far as, do you have to make the decision today? The PR conversation, we did discuss it a little bit at the March meeting. Trends have definitely shifted since the race, and the outcome of that race has definitely had an impact on those sales. Will we see the impact of that immediately? No, we probably won't see that for another 2 years. Excuse me. The next presentation, which you did not bring up, but I will, is the shift from the general fund to the commission, the responsibility of those 5 programs, and also the associated legislation that was passed for fee increases and what the estimated projections were on the result of those increases. That will also maybe come into consideration. Last year we talked about this fund, and something that I failed to mention, and I regret not mentioning it then, is that if you think about the lifetime license fund, it is a fund earned strictly from the sale of lifetime licenses. And as you know, those licenses are valid for the remainder of anyone's lifetime in the state of Wyoming. And the corpus on that account is not really a corpus as you would think, like our trust fund corpus. We have no ability to touch it. That's why the commission has this opportunity each year. But if you think of this 6% as almost the revenue earned for the period of use on those lifetimes transferred to the operating fund, whether it stays in the operating fund or stays in the trust fund, and whether a commission chooses to use it or not, makes really not much difference. It's just that it is shifted so that the commission has that opportunity to use if necessary. By leaving it in a lifetime fund, we can't spend out of that fund. We can only do this one-time transfer per year. And as far as the interest goes, Treasurer Gordon, you heard speak earlier about the state investment pool. Both of these operating fund and the lifetime license fund are in the same pool. So as far as it goes as rate of return, we're not going to see more than a 2.5% regardless of the side of the pot it's in. That may have been more than you were looking for, but.
No, it's good.
Mark, so our next meeting is in July, which is after the fiscal year, unless we had a special meeting, I suppose. But I'm glad you reminded us of that. So you got guys that, I have a lifetime license fund, and I went fishing and went and looked for some Preeble's mouses and stuff like that this year. So you didn't get any money for my licenses, so this is taking money for that to help pay for the guys that have the lifetime license fund.
President Culver, Commissioner tell me that's correct. So for everyone who holds a lifetime license, when you purchase that license, your payment went into this fund. And this is the commission's opportunity on an annual basis to move a piece of that where you can actually use it.
Pay for the rate, yeah.
Right.
Mr. President,
Commissioner Crank.
I guess discussion maybe. Did you have a question?
I was just, the only thing I wanted to state was it sounds like that it might be a good time for, or a good year for us to go ahead and make this transfer based on a lot of circumstances that we have this year that we didn't have last year. With what the legislature's done, probably a lot of reduced license sales, PR money that may or may not be reduced. So in my opinion, I think it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and transfer this this year while we have the opportunity to do so.
Mr. President, I'd agree. I mean, we're talking about $300,000, which is not significant to our $60-some million budget. So I think we just go ahead. I would support transferring this year rather than retaining it.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I make that motion that we accept the department's recommendation to transfer this money.
Tell me again the amount of money we're talking about.
President Culver, it will be between $351,000, which is 6% of the balance as it is right now, and I anticipate $354,000 by the end of June, based on that amount.
Can we have a second on the motion?
Seconded.
Okay. Commissioner Schmidt seconded that. Any discussion? All those in favor of transferring this, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Meredith.
Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. President, members of the Commission, Director Talbot. By way of background on this agenda item, as you know, at the last commission meeting, we discussed the fact that the budget bill that went through this last legislative session removed general fund support to the commission for 5 programs: sage grouse, wolf management, sensitive species, veterinary services, and aquatic invasive species. That occurred in the middle of this biennium, of the 17-18 biennium. At this point, I was going to go into some of the history of the general fund budget to the commission. That's since been incorporated into Meredith's presentation. So I'm just going to hand this over to Meredith at this point, and she's going to run through how we got to what the department's recommendation is to add to the commission's FY18 budget. That is the budget that you provided preliminary approval of at the last commission meeting. We would be adding this to your FY18 budget. And I'm going to let Meredith come on up and go through this presentation with you.
So as John mentioned, and we did have quite a lot of conversation at the last commission meeting, the impact of this last legislative session regarding our 5 historically generally funded programs. And just to remind you, AIS, Vet Services, Sensitive Species, Sage Grouse, and wolf. Something that was a little bit awkward, I guess you can say, is that the legislature approved a biennium budget. And so these program coordinators and managers planned for a 2-year period of funding based on that, what was approved. Half of that, plus some, was removed this legislative session. So that was sort of the foundation, the basis of where we decided to start with planning the request for you to take on the responsibility of funding for the remainder of the biennium, which is through FY18. Your previous commission in August of 2015 were presented a budget request for these 5 programs of $12.6 million. And that commission gave authorization to submit that request to the governor and the legislature. So that request went to them in January of that year, of 16, excuse me. And $500,000 of that amount were for exception requests. Those exception requests were immediately denied, and so it left the balance of that request $12.1 million. After that, the governor and the legislature made some additional reductions. They took 10% off of travel, they took 5% off of contractual services, and then they took 1.5% off everything. And then they also applied an insurance rate holiday, which is really insignificant. It would have had no impact on the budget itself or the program because those rates were held constant. So today, the amount that was remaining after all of those additional cuts that I mentioned was $11.7 million. And so today, that number divided by 2 Samuel, is this playing or? Thank you. Half of that amount is this 5.875 that we have in front of you. And you can see by each of those 5 programs what that is. The one thing this legislative session 2017 did to get down to that 4.9 number, I don't know if any of you recall, but some of you may have that in the back of your head. They took an additional 8% off of the wolf management program, which was just about $500,000 per fiscal year. And with the current status of wolves and the anticipated re-management requirement for the department, we thought it would be wise to go ahead and get that budget back up to where it was originally approved by the legislature. So with that, I know it's a quick overview, but if there are any questions, I'll be happy to stand for those now.
Mark? I don't have a problem with this, but the wolf management, and I don't want to go through that budget today, but does that include damages? Does this $700,000 include damage?
President Culver, Commissioner Anselmi, you'll see the breakdown here. The damage is included in this 200 series support services cost, and I believe the individual line item is $250,000 of this is earmarked for damage.
Other questions?
Mr. President,
Commissioner Crank.
so what are you asking for us? You're asking us to build this 5 million into our general fund,
So
for our general operating budget.
the department would like to request the commission's authorization to increase our FY18 commission budget by $5,875,571 for these specific programs.
Okay. Can we have a little bit of just a
bet.
little bit of discussion on this, Mr. President? You know, it's crazy. I appreciate the legislature giving us some authority to increase some license fees, and I assume we'll have to look at doing so. But, you know, a great example in this is aquatic invasive species. That should not be funded off the backs of sportsmen. I mean, whether we have the importing of aquatic invasive species would be horribly traumatic and detrimental to this state. I mean, it could clog every city's access to their city water supplies. But it's not a sportsman issue. You know, whether we have aquatic invasive species, we're still going to have fish and an ability to do what we do as a wildlife agency. So it was smart that Governor Meade and prior leaders had seen to generally fund these. There are just things like wolf management, grizzly bear management that should be funded not on the backs of sportsmen, but on the general fund, so that the largest group of taxpayers in this state take care of those expenditures that we've voluntarily taken on. But, you know, so I think as this goes forward, I'm going to support building this into our budget because it's been thrown at us this year, and I think we have to. But I think that discussion needs to continue, that stuff particularly like aquatic invasive species, wolf management now is a little bit different because that's going to be in our realm. And we can actually sell hunting licenses and we can manage those animals. But think of grizzly bears, you know, until they're delisted. I've seen presentations that the sportsmen of Wyoming have spent $40 million managing grizzly bears, and the feds won't let us manage them or hunt them. So that's just wrong. I mean, if grizzly bears continue to be listed, those kind of expenditures need to be generally funded versus funded on the backs of sportsmen. So I'll support this, but going forward, we really need to look at some of these. You know, aquatic invasive species should be funded by the Water Development Commission. That's an issue that threatens the water delivery system of Wyoming. It doesn't threaten the fisheries of Wyoming, and we're a wildlife agency. So I just think we need to look at these carefully as we go forward. We need to do it this year, but let's look at those because this is just wrong. I mean, you should fund those on the backs of the people who are benefiting from the expenditures. And aquatic invasive species benefits every citizen in Wyoming, not just those that buy fishing licenses. I get off my soapbox.
Thanks for those comments, Pat.
I like it.
Other comments?
Well said, Pat.
Mr. Chairman, I move we accept the department's recommendation.
Second.
Commissioner Doobie made the motion, seconded by Commissioner Anselmi. Discussion. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. Next up.
Commissioner President Culver, Commissioner Director Talbot. Our next presenter will be Hank Edwards. Hank is a 20-year veteran with the department in the wildlife health field, and he's currently the wildlife health lab supervisor in Laramie that I mentioned yesterday is part of our veterinary services branch. Hank will be giving a update and overview of the department's 2016 brucellosis surveillance efforts around the state. Hank?
Always a pleasure to have you, Hank. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the commission, Director Talbot, thank you for passing our budget. I appreciate that.
Mr. President.
Commissioner Craig.
Hank, did you know Mary Wood said we wouldn't have chronic wasting disease if it was all your fault? So
Yeah, I know.
how are you going to solve that?
I get the blame for a lot of things, actually. And you can be no different. If you'd like to blame me for brucellosis, that's fine. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to present what I've been working on for 20 years and bring
some of the new commissioners up to speed on brucellosis and some of the problems with it, as well as with the commissioners that are already up to speed where we are today. So I threw together this talk, pretty simple. First talk about the disease. I'll move on to brucellosis in elk and bison of the GYA. Mostly I'll touch just briefly on bison. And then finally I'll finish up my talk talking about how we monitor this disease, both in our feed grounds and our non-feed ground populations. So first of all, Brucella abortus is found worldwide. It's been around for thousands of years, and it affects many people. Over 500,000 people are affected by brucellosis each year. So it's a big disease. It doesn't just occur in northwestern Wyoming. It is very persistent, and it's able to persist by hiding in the host cells. So once it's hidden, it's also hidden from the immune system, so it can just stay there. So chronic infections are the problem. But as far as bacteria go, it's slow to mutate. So it doesn't develop resistance very quickly. It's very susceptible to environmental conditions. It's easily killed by disinfectants, and it's sensitive to many antibiotics. So unlike the prion that Mary talked about yesterday morning, this is the opposite. Outside the host, it's super easy to get rid of. Inside the host, that's a little different deal. So as far as host goes, there's a whole multitude of hosts. Basically, any mammal that gets in contact with B. abortus can become infected. But it really likes ungulates. That's where it's the happiest. So elk, bison, cattle, very happy. And it likes to localize in the reproductive tract. So once an animal becomes infected, that organism can just lay in wait and doesn't cause much problem. So in males, it's no big deal. But on the start of the 3rd trimester in pregnancy, which is going to be around February 15th, this organism becomes very active and moves towards the reproductive system, where it infects all those tissues, eventually the fetus, and eventually causes abortion. But outside the host, if you go outside of ungulates to other mammals, it usually does not cause abortions. They're considered dead-end hosts because the disease is usually not transmitted from those other hosts. So if a horse becomes infected, it's usually a dead-end host. But the problem is chronic infections. If that infection isn't caught early enough, then it can set up places to hide, and it stays there for a very long time. So that's why treatment is difficult. So although it's sensitive to antibiotics, it's really good at hiding out of the reach of antibiotics. So if you get a horse with brucellosis, fistulous withers, it's impossible to treat. So why do we care? Why do we care about brucellosis? 2 big reasons: the livestock industry and humans. So the federal government undertook an eradication program in 1934. In 1934, 10 to 15% of all the cattle in the United States had brucellosis. So they set out to eradicate it by 1998, and they almost made it. I think they made it in about 2007, except the GYA. They couldn't go any farther than the GYA. So, and we know that since then, in the last 16 years, we've had 20 plus cattle herds come down with brucellosis. All those that could be documented was documented to come from elk. So if you're Colorado and you've spent all this money to eradicate brucellosis from your state, and you have some rancher that's within the DSA or where brucellosis is endemic in Wyoming, are you going to take their cattle? Are you going to take that risk of allowing brucellosis to become established perhaps in your state? So you can see where the livestock industry is on this. This is not an easy thing. So if you don't succeed, then you just change the goals, right? So that's what the federal government did, as well as the states. They said, rather than, since we're not going to be able to eradicate all of it, we'll just create what's called a DSA, Designated Surveillance Area, and it's outlined there in red. So that, of course, extends up into Montana as well as into Idaho. And it simply means everything inside that box, brucellosis
has a chance of becoming in contact with brucellosis as opposed to outside the box. So if you're a rancher inside the box, you're subject to many more regulations, movement restrictions, increased surveillance, et cetera, than if you're outside that box. But it's more than just increased movement restrictions and increased costs. The big thing is if one of your cows comes up blood test positive, then you're under quarantine, and that's the killer. Because if you have to feed those animals during the course of a quarantine, which can be longer than a year, it can literally take a lot of ranchers completely out of business because they can't graze those cattle. And unfortunately, vaccination is not the silver bullet. Vaccination will stop the disease process. In other words, the cow does not abort, but the cow still seroconverts. In other words, it's still blood test positive. So by vaccination, it helped the rancher, right? He didn't have brucellosis run through his herd, but his herd is still under quarantine. So he doesn't get out of that quarantine by vaccination. So besides the livestock industry, the other problem is human brucellosis. As I mentioned, it's a major disease worldwide. We don't see a lot of it in the United States because we've eradicated the disease for the most part. But in other parts of the world, many people come in contact with brucellosis by eating unpasteurized milk, cheese, etc. In fact, I think I mentioned this last time I presented on brucellosis. I had the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, send me cheese from Mexico. Actually, it was in Texas, right on the Mexico border, and it was positive for melentensis. So that's a big deal. Here you go to Walmart, you think you're going to buy safe cheese? Well, maybe not so. So anyway, in humans, the disease is called undulant fever or undulating fever, meaning you get peaks and valleys during the course of that fever. It has a very extended incubation time compared to other diseases. It can be 6 weeks from the time you're infected until symptoms start to appear. So it's hard to remember how you could have been exposed a month and a half ago. Chronic infections, like I mentioned, those who don't seek treatment or don't have access to treatment are pretty much condemned to have brucellosis for a long time. Some of the common symptoms in humans: malaise, fatigue, night sweats, depression, as well as muscle and joint pain. But usually a 6-week course of oral antibiotics will clear it up if it's treated early, and it'll clear about 70% of cases. All right, so that's a background on the disease. I'll move forward to brucellosis in the GYA. But before I go too far, I presented at the BCT meeting, the Brucellosis Coordination Team meeting a few days ago, and a very kind commissioner mentioned it'd sure be nice to know what in the world you're talking about. So I threw up a slide just to give you some background terminology, because as my talk progresses, I'm going to use a lot more of these terms. So if you look at the top there, as you all know, when an animal comes in contact with a bug, the body responds by producing antibodies. Once those antibodies are circulating in the bloodstream, and that can take up to 2 weeks, then it has two outcomes. One, the antibody, along with the rest of the immune system, clears the infection. So a good example is the common cold. We all get the common cold, and the body responds and clears that cold. The kicker is we all have antibodies circulating in our blood to the colds we had 2, 3, 4 years ago, and even longer. So we could essentially get a blood sample and see which cold you were exposed to. The other outcome is that antibody, along with the immune system, is not able to clear the infection. So the infection just lays and waits without necessarily disease. A good example of that is chickenpox. We all get chickenpox, the body responds, but that virus lays and waits, and then of course can reemerge as shingles as we get older. So when we do a blood test on an elk, what we're looking for is antibodies. And since we're detecting antibodies, the only thing we can say is that animal was exposed. We cannot say by any stretch of the imagination that that animal is infected or is able to spread the disease. That's a big deal. People don't get that. So as I move forward in my talk, I'll talk about seropositive or seroprevalence. All I'm saying is there's antibodies in the blood. That's it. Or the number of antibodies, or the number of animals that have antibodies in the blood. So this is a live animal test, right? Antemortem. But if you want to know if the animal is infected, you got to culture it. And to culture it, you need to kill it, you need to collect tissues, and actually try and find the bug. It's not very sensitive, particularly with brucellosis. We know that chronic infections, there's just a few bacteria in there, and they're in just a few organs. So it's the luck of the draw. If you get the right tissue on the right plate on the right day, when the planets are lined up, whether you're going to get a positive or not. And of course, this is our postmortem test.
Hank,
sir.
The other day during your presentation, they were talking about PCR DNA. Is that going to give us a better indicator on what's going on actually with culture positive and what actually has happened? And any time frame on that?
That's a great question. PCR will replace, hopefully, culture. Culture is very arduous. It can take 2 or 3 weeks. PCR will be very quick, and the sensitivity is much better. So PCR will help us in that respect. But unfortunately, it is still post-mortem test.
Timeline?
I would expect within a year that assay will be made available.
And just one more question, Commissioner. Why post-mortem then? Why can't we pull out part of a lymph node or something like that? Is it still the solid shooter technology that they're still hiding and the PCR won't pick that up?
That's exactly right. It is still the salad shooter technology. I'm surprised you remember that. I think I mentioned that several years ago. But the problem is this bug occurs in the lymph nodes of the reproductive tract. Those lymph nodes are tucked up tight against the pelvis. So if you wanted to go in there and do a lymph node biopsy, chances are your patient is not going to survive. So that's usually not done. It's not worth doing for what you'd have to do to get it. So at this point, and even when the PCR is available, we will still be looking at tissue, killing the animal to collect tissue samples. To detect brucellosis in blood samples is possible, but the window that this bacteria is present in the blood is about a week, and then it's pretty well absent. So that technology is not here yet.
Thank you, sir.
All right, moving on from my talk. Obviously, brucellosis is endemic in elk and bison of the greater Yellowstone area. And the greater Yellowstone area is not just Yellowstone National Park, right? We're talking about area that extends up into Montana, Idaho, as well as a significant portion of northwestern Wyoming. We know that that brucellosis was introduced into the GYA right around the Civil War. So 1860s, and since then we have detected brucellosis in bison in 1917 and elk in 1930. We know that cows abort their very first calf after exposure. They usually do not abort after that. Probably as the animal gets older, they may abort again, but for the most part they abort just their first calf. So in bison, brucellosis loves bison. It's very efficient. It's got an 82 abortion rate. That meaning that 82% of newly infected heifers will abort their calf. Doesn't have to be a heifer, just the newly infected. And 61% of elk. But because there's not that many new animals that are infected each year, this is not a population limiting disease. And of course, there's feed grounds and brucellosis. If you haven't heard about that yet, you will. State and federal feed grounds were established in the early 1900s to sustain populations, but as time went on, they also served to keep elk out of private hay stores and reduce damage, but most importantly, they keep cattle away from elk, or vice versa, right? There are currently 22 state and 1 federal feed grounds that are operated in the state. Here's a map of those, and you can see a lot of our feed grounds are positioned so that they hold those elk. So as elk are moving from their winter grounds down, or from their summer grounds, excuse me, to where they would be moving to their winter range, it serves to hold those elk before they move on to private property. So you can see Jackson National Elk Refuge is up in the upper left, and then Pinedale sits right down there. So the problem is with feed grounds, of course, because the animals are concentrated, when there's an aborted fetus, lots of critters become in contact with it. And that's the primary method that brucellosis is transmitted. There are incredible high amounts of bacteria in those aborted fetuses. So when one is aborted, it is really efficient at spreading that disease around. So when there's an abortion, like I mentioned, there's lots and lots of contact. Bison tend to be more of a herd animal. So when there's an abortion in a bison herd, it contacts lots of critters. Plus, it's very efficient, like I mentioned, in bison. So you'll see our prevalence in bison is about twice what it is in elk. So brucellosis seroprevalence, like I just mentioned, on elk averages about 28%. Bison, it's about 65%. And that's pretty constant. We monitor our bison populations every 2 to 3 years. It stays right around 65%. That's in males and females.
So if I'm correct with my math, some of those abortions do occur while elk are on the feed ground, correct?
That's correct.
What's the policy with those fetuses? How does the department handle those?
Mr. President, the policy is we request those feeders to collect those fetuses. They're very attractive for carnivores. Carnivores love to eat fetuses, and they clean them up quickly, which is a good thing.
Thank you. Dr. Hank, just the next one, how long does the fetus, how long is the fetus contagious? I mean, after the abortion? Is it like a day, 2 days, or is it just hours?
Mr. President, that's a good question, and it really depends on the environmental conditions at the time. So if it's winter and it's moist, that fetus can remain infected for a very long time. If it starts to dry out, if it's exposed to the sun's rays, that fetus will lose infectivity. But underneath the fetus, in the spring, where it stays cool and moist, that bacteria will remain viable. So when it's consumed by a predator or something else, remember that for the most part, brucellosis, if it's infected, say a grizzly bear consumes that fetus, that grizzly bear, although it will become blood test positive, will not transmit that disease.
Thank you. Mr. President?
Yes.
Is it just a matter of picking up the fetus? I mean, if the feed ground personnel pick up the fetus, is that it, or I mean, does it contaminate any of that ground or around it that needs to be cleaned up as well?
Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, yes, the ground would remain infected, if you will. As long as that bacteria can remain cool and moist, it will remain viable. They have done studies in barns, dairy barns in Europe, and it's lived for 6 or 8 months, survived. So given the right conditions, although it's a wimpy bug, given the right conditions, it can last a long time. All right, so like I mentioned, seroprevalence in bison is about twice or over twice what it is in elk. And obviously the continued existence of feed grounds is complex. That is the most understated statement I'll make my whole entire career. And then finally, we know that even if you were to eliminate the feed grounds, brucellosis will still be maintained. We do have herds around the Cody and Meeteetse region where we have prevalences that are above 28% in some of those herds, and those are a long ways from feed grounds. So, last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how we monitor brucellosis in the state. The first, I'll talk about feed ground surveillance. This is the Muddy Creek Trap, which is just outside of Boulder. Brucellosis, monitoring brucellosis on the feed ground falls under Brandon Skurlock's shop, the BFH group, which is positioned out of Pinedale. And their job is to monitor brucellosis on the feed ground as well as development of management actions to reduce brucellosis in elk and therefore transmission to cattle. So they do all kinds of things from experimenting with how the hay is distributed. It's called low density feeding, trying to stop that end date of feeding in the spring as early as possible, some of those other things. And they monitor the effectiveness of those management actions by bleeding between 4 and 7 feed grounds per year. We monitor feed seroprevalence over time, and we've been monitoring both the Del Creek and the Grays River feed ground for between 20 and 30 years. So we have a very long-term data set of this disease in elk. So I've thrown together a few pictures, give you a chance to sleep for a few seconds here. These pictures were taken by Mark Goki, our Jackson I&E person. So first of all, those elk are baited into corrals with lots of hay. Once they're in the corral, they're then sorted and pushed towards the working chutes. And the working chutes, which is just big enough for an elk, and there's usually 4 or 5 working chutes in a row. Those elk are bled. It's amazing that they will stand there and be bled, but for the most part they do. Once in a while they try and kill you, but for the most part they stand there. From there we collect all kinds of information, we ear tag them, and then we simply release them. Once those blood samples are collected, they're sent down to my laboratory, and unfortunately there's really not one good assay for brucellosis. There's several mediocre ones, and if we combine those several mediocres, we get what we consider to be a pretty reliable assay. So we test several thousand elk a year, actually, between our 2 programs. So I just threw this up there just so you can see that the seroprevalence on feed grounds varies a lot. And it varies a lot from year to year. So unlike the bison that are pretty constant, yeah, not so much on the feed grounds. So you can see we're up above 60% to below 10%. That may take several years for that much of a variation to occur, but nonetheless, there's some big variations. We understand why we get increases sometimes or decreases. Like I mentioned, if those elk are on the feed ground for a long time, they're exposed to more abortions, then we expect a higher seroprevalence the following year. That said, there's a lot of reasons that seroprevalence fluctuates that we don't have a clue of. For a disease that's been around for thousands of years, it's amazing how little we understand, not just cattle, but elk and bison as well. Moving on to brucellosis surveillance in non-feed ground elk. Rather than relying on capturing the elk on the feed ground, we instead rely on hunters to get us samples for this. So our surveillance program is based on cow elk, and every year we assemble and send out somewhere between 10 and 11,000 blood collection kits, and we send those directly to hunters. So from the 11,000 kits that we send out, we get somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 1,400 kits returned. That sounds pretty dismal, but it's not so bad. When you consider that 40% of hunters are successful, half of them, which is really good, will take the time to remember the kit, bring it to the field, and fill it up with blood. And then finally, about 60% of those samples that we make it back to the laboratory are suitable for testing. We try and cover each hunt area across the state every 4 to 5 years, and we've been doing this for 26 years and have looked at or tested over 14,000 samples. Here's a blood collection kit. Many of you probably have gotten one of these in the past. It's pretty simple. We just ask the sportsmen when they harvest their animal, take that blood tube, fill it with blood from the heart or the neck or thoracic cavity, put the tube in a bag. That keeps the post office happy. Fill out the data sheet. That keeps us happy. Throw it all in the box, put the label on it, and send it back to the laboratory. I threw up our 2016 surveillance just to give you an idea of how our surveillance goes every single year. These areas here, this is where I was mentioning that we have a high seroprevalence. So we hit these areas inside the DSA just to monitor those herds. This ring of hunt areas that goes around the DSA border, those we hit every year. And that's to monitor spillover outside the DSA as well as monitor around the Wind River Indian Reservation. These areas up here in the northeast, these are part of what we call our statewide surveillance. So next year, in 2017, we'll hit here, and then we'll slowly move our way back around this corner of the state. So every 4 years, we try and cover this entire area. But the focus of our brucellosis surveillance is on the bighorns, and you can see that's outlined in green. So all these hunt areas are our focus for most of our surveillance activities. And the reason for that is because in 2012 we found one positive elk in hunt area 40 on the western slope of the bighorns. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for lots of reasons, but the main reason is brucellosis made it to the GYA in 1860 and has stayed there within that GYA until 2012, for the most part. There's been a few others, but for the most part, it stayed within that area. Now we're seeing brucellosis move out of the GYA into herds that are not associated with it.
What's the picture look like above that line as far as brucellosis?
Mr. President, Commissioner Doobie, that's a very good question.
Because it didn't necessarily have to go from west to east. It could have come from north to
You're
south.
going to make me say something like, but up here is the Crow Indian Reservation, and from what I understand, there isn't a lot of data on what the seroprevalence is in their, I don't know if they have bison. Do you know if that, Scott, if they have bison in the Crow? Yeah. Do they? As well as elk. So we don't have a lot of information to answer your question.
And thus the elk study we're doing.
I'm sorry?
And the study we're doing.
And the study we're doing, correct. And I'll get to that. So anyway, this positive changed the way we have done surveillance for the last 15 years. We really revamped our program to try and get as many samples as we possibly could out of the bighorns so that we can have a good idea of exactly what this disease is doing. Is it becoming established? How widespread is it, etc. So some of the changes we've done is a relocation of one of the BFH positions out of the Cody region, and that position was moved, or out of the Pinedale region, excuse me, to the Cody region. We hired temporary field technicians, and their job was simply to follow hunters around with a kit in their hand, make sure that the hunter had the kit, and then when the hunter harvested his animal, to get that blood sample as quickly as they could. We also submitted sent out additional blood collection kits to hunters. We used to send out about 8,000, and now we're up to about 11,000 now. We increased the number of usable samples by increasing sample drop-off points. These coolers here, we scattered coolers throughout the bighorn, so hunters, rather than forgetting that blood sample on the dash of their pickup for 2 weeks before they drop it in the mail, can drop it off there so we can preserve that sample. We also have blood processed at regional offices rather than sending it all to the laboratory where it can freeze in the mail. And then finally, at the request of the Wyoming Livestock Board, we instituted weekly laboratory testing where we make those results available. Just a few pictures of how we contact hunters. Again, any opportunity we have to put a face to the request of please get us a blood sample from your elk. It's made a big difference. So since that initial discovery in 2012, we have sent out over 29,000 blood collection kits to hunters in the bighorns. 27,852 were mailed directly, and about 1,500 were handed out in the field. From those kits that have been sent out, almost 30,000, we received 3,075 samples back into the laboratory, with 69% of those being suitable for testing. This year, our recovery rate was not 69%. This year, in 2016, it was 73%. So we're getting better and better at collecting those samples and preserving them. But unfortunately, when you collect a lot of samples, you also find some of the results that may not make you so happy. So over the course of the last 4 years, we have found 11 seropositive elk from 4 hunt areas. 1 positive bull from hunt area 39. From hunt area 40, which is where we started, we've recovered 8, 7 cows and 1 bull. And then from hunt area 41 and 49, a bull apiece. But nonetheless, we still have less than 1% seroprevalence within our bighorns, meaning that the disease is still at a very, very low level. But at this point, I would say it's become established. We were hoping this was a flash in the pan. I'm not so sure that's the case. There's a map showing where those positives occur. As you can see, hunt area 40 there is where most of them occur. And then we have a few scattered up and down.
Mr. President, Hank, does Montana recognize brucellosis, and are they monitoring? Are they taking samples? What are they doing?
Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, yes, Montana has an active brucellosis surveillance program. They used to do a lot of hunter surveillance like what I'm describing here. They've since gone away from that, and they do long-term studies where they actually helicopter capture certain populations, and that's how they're getting their sample size in each area. That said, on the Crow Indian Reservation, I don't believe there's a lot of sampling there.
Yeah. You know, I was shocked this last summer, a Montana commissioner told me they didn't have CWD in Montana.
That's
And I
because they don't
laughed,
look.
which is crazy. So I was just wondering if they had the same ostrich kind of mentality with regard to brucellosis.
No, they don't with brucellosis. So, and this gets back to answering your question. 2 years ago, we initiated an elk movement study with the goal of capturing 150 elk over the next 3 years. Actually, we're 2 years into that study now. We've captured over 100 elk. And our goal is to identify the potential source of that brucellosis, and maybe we can do something to stop that flow if it's possible. Identify calving areas and areas of risk for livestock. Evaluate the movement, interaction, and dispersal of some of these elk. And then finally, model potential spread. If this disease does move from the bighorns, where do we really have to worry that may be next? So anyway, each animal that's captured has a GPS collar, and those collars will report locations for the next 3 years. So this is a long-term study. This is my last slide, and I threw it up here just to give you an idea of what the scope is with brucellosis now. So you've been listening to me talk for the last half hour about all the ways that we measure this disease, and I think we've done a good job determining where brucellosis occurs in the state and where it doesn't. But nonetheless, it occurs in a very significant portion of the state. You can see with the DSA line there, yeah, the DSA line isn't exactly where brucellosis occurs. It's close, but unfortunately brucellosis is starting to move east. So time will tell how far this goes. It's like I was telling Scott, when I first started 20 years ago, brucellosis wasn't quite so spread. And the problem is there isn't a lot of tools in the toolbox to stop this disease from moving. So here's a career disease, which is unfortunate.
Mr. President, we were at a livestock meeting a couple of years ago regarding brucellosis in that area, and they were talking about voluntary efforts on the west slope for the livestock industry to voluntarily test their cattle on a time of basis. Are they still doing that? Are you aware of that? What's the status of that? Or
Commissioner Culver, President Culver, Commissioner Dewey. I am not exactly aware of what the livestock regulations are. I believe it is still voluntary. I don't think they've gone to mandatory, have they? Still voluntary.
Yeah, well, they were specifically talking about that west slope area when we were doing it. They were talking to some of us. I'm on the southeast side. I raised on the mountain there, and you know, they were just keeping us informed as to what was going on.
Mr. President, members of the commission, it's my understanding that that will still be voluntary as long as that's not part of the DSA.
Other questions for Hank?
If there's not any questions, Mr. President, I would certainly like to take a moment and recognize Hank and his folks in the region, the Pinedale region, Jackson region, and also the Cody region. There's been a lot of pressure put on these folks to do a lot of work with brucellosis, and every time it comes up, our folks step up, and Hank leads that. So good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hank.
Thank you.
So I might mention, David Rael represents the commission on the governor's task force, brucellosis task force. You recently met, isn't it correct?
Yes, Tuesday.
Anything you would like to share with the commission?
Just that I asked Hank if he could give us a brief orientation on brucellosis. It's a big concern. It's a major concern right now. Right now, Montana's making us test everything that goes into Montana. It used to be we could get a health certificate from a vet and then proceed. Now everything has to be bled. I think it's annually, I think, isn't it? Yes, it is. So that and I don't know, Scott, is there something I'm missing besides that was the major point that I think is going to affect us in the cattle industry in the future. There's so many that go to Montana. So,
Mr. President, members of the commission, I might add, certainly the state's effort with developing a vaccine and the long drawn-out story about the BSL-3 lab and Laramie and I guess our lack of ability to do anything because of the condition of that facility. But certainly there remains significant conversations about trying to develop a more efficacious vaccine to protect cattle and elk on that. But as David and Commissioner Rael and Hank have indicated, this will be a long-term project for us.
I'd like to add too that in years past, I always thought that the heifer vaccination that we give, the Bangs vaccination, was actually an inoculation of this disease, but it's not. Can you explain that a little bit, Hank?
Were you giving RB51 or strain 19?
Yeah.
So RB51 is a live vaccine.
It is a modified live.
That's correct. It is, and strain 19, it's similar to RB51, but won't give false positive reactions. So it is a live vaccine. You are setting up an infection, but strain 19 will not cause abortion because it can't. I can go into it, but anyway, it won't cause abortion, and neither will RB51, right? Unless you give a very high dose at the wrong gestation period, it will also not cause abortion. So again, these vaccines are being inoculated. They're producing antibodies specific for brucellosis, and when an animal is exposed, they stop the disease process. So they're stopping that bug from setting up a chronic infection, essentially. But they're still going to be blood test positive. You're still going to be quarantined if you are exposed.
So the bovine might not get the disease, but it's a carrier.
That's right. That's right. So you're not going to see an abortion storm in your herd. So because it's going to stop that abortion from happening. So that's the big benefit of vaccination. So vaccination is definitely the thing to do, of course. But it's not going to stop you from being quarantined. To have a vaccination that induces sterile immunity, and that means that when it's exposed, the vaccine is so effective, it kills the bug immediately, so that you never develop blood test positives. We're a long ways from that. We're a very long ways from that.
There's also, Commissioner Ryle, a lot of work that's been done by former Commissioner Price and others looking at booster vaccinations and the right timing for that, and trying to figure out if that's more efficacious in preventing an abortion.
Thanks, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee or commission, I might just add, there's been a lot of discussion in the Brucellosis Coordination Committee about strain 19 versus RB51, and looking back historically at the department and how we operated, and also worked with livestock producers, and particularly in the Pinedale and Big Piney area. 35 years ago, there was 1 to 20 elk with nearly every feed line in Sublette County. I was over there and fed elk and saw that. And at that time, they used strain 19 vaccine, and it wasn't a significant issue. Now they have moved to RB51, and you're well aware that since 2003, it's been a pretty significant issue. We've had 20 outbreaks since then, and the department has been very diligent about commingling. Any elk that are on cattle feed lines are either moved to feed grounds or lethally removed if we can't create that separation. So we have been very diligent about that in cooperation with the landowners over there, and we continue to have more and more outbreaks of brucellosis with the shift on that vaccine. And there are some members of the brucellosis coordination team that feel very strongly about the difference between strain 19 and RB51. I'm not a vet, so I won't go there, just an observation of where we've been at.
Thank you. Good discussion. We sure appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're down to one last agenda item. Mr. Edberg.
Commissioner President Culver, Commissioner Director Talbot, I'll make this quick. We're getting to the time of the year when our field personnel have the unpleasant job of having to deal with orphaned, abandoned, or picked up young of the year wildlife, and the options to what to do with that wildlife are often limited. And so we're requesting that the Commission give Chief Nesvik the approval to make a decision what we'd like to do with that orphaned, abandoned, or picked up wildlife, specifically being able to donate it to universities and zoos in accordance with Commission Policy 7F. We currently have a request from the Minnesota Zoo for pronghorn fawns, and they will cover the entire costs of coming here and getting those and taking them back to the Minnesota Zoo. So with that, we're just asking that the Commission give the authority for the department to look at donating these orphaned, abandoned, or other ways alone, mainly young of the year wildlife, in accordance with policy and with the approval of the Chief Game Warden.
So where do we stage these animals? I assume we don't take them to Sebile.
Well, for pronghorn, Sebile is a possibility, as is sometimes when we have a bear, but a lot of times like a bear cub, we'll just leave it in the region and for a couple of days and be able to take care of it. Obviously deer and elk are a concern. We could not take those to Sebile. We'd have to keep them like at a regional office or a game warden station for a day or two until arrangements can be made for them to be transported to the appropriate facility. And there's to be honest with you, there's not a lot of need for these species, and a lot of times, the unpleasant work of having to euthanize them. And but this does give us one other option than having to deal with that. And we do it professionally and know it's part of our job. But if there's another option, it sure would be nice for us to have that in our toolbox.
Mr. President, if it's a buffalo, you just put it in the minivan.
Send it to Canada.
I've seen that, yes.
So we have a lot of oversight. We look at these pretty strict. They're just not going to go to mom and pop's backyard zoo. We're going to look for an accredited zoo. Going to use them for other universities. Use them for research. But we are not asking for authority like collecting 20 elk for research down like you've done past meetings. These are very small numbers of animals, very specific, and to these specific facilities.
So I think this is a good deal, but can I clarify, what you're asking here today is a one-time authorization for antelope to the Minnesota Zoo, or is it broader than that?
We'd like to get the authority for us to have broader authority so we don't have to come back to you every time as per commission policy, and that this would be under the authority of Brian, review and approval.
I understand.
I think to clarify though, Mr. President, young of the year, correct, for zoos or other institutions of higher learning, any kind of, there are some definite considerations that go into requests for adult big game animals that do need to come on a case-by-case basis through the commission. This is strictly young of the year for zoos or universities.
For educational or research purposes.
Questions?
Yes.
Mark?
What's the survival rate on, I thought that sometimes these people find these little ponds and they end up or you get some a little bigger than make it.
Commissioner President Kohler, Commissioner Director Talbot, it really varies on how long these people have had them, how long they've been away from their mother, and so, the other option is we have to euthanize that, and maybe sometimes, we can get them back and get them sent off somewhere they will, live a full life. It's really variable. How long have they been abandoned or alone is a big factor. And what have the people that have had them, fed them, dairy milk isn't going to do any good to a abandoned calf or pronghorn fawn.
Other questions?
I would so move.
Second.
Commissioner Crank, seconded by Pete. Any discussion?
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I would issue a call to the public. If anybody has anything they would like to address the commission on. Any other commissioner have anything to bring before us? Pete?
Mr. Chairman, I had the opportunity to visit the Story Fish Hatchery not too long ago, and I just wanted to publicly acknowledge and thank them for Steve, Brad, and Jennifer for having me there, help them spawn some rainbow and learn about the facility. Those guys do an outstanding job, and as well as the rest of the people across the state. But I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank them.
Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge the fisheries folks for the tour of Spee's Hatchery the other day. Very enjoyable, very informative. Anybody that hadn't been there, I would strongly encourage they get a tour of that hatchery. Anybody else? With that, I guess we are adjourned.